Number 10. Thrall traders. Now look, Vikings weren't all that bad. Sure, they would go off to other countries and lands and raid and pillage for a bit of sport. They'd de-life you and your family, or they would take the people from your village that could do some good manual labor and bring them back to the market where they were sold to other Vikings as thralls. But okay, you know what? Yeah, I'm not really making this any better. The selling and purchasing of actual people has unfortunately been a successful business strategy in almost every single corner of the world for as long as there have been people to do it. And the Vikings were not exempt from this. While it was a standard way of living at the time, the people who actually auctioned off thralls for silver and gold pieces, or for goods like furs, weapons, livestock, and food, by our standards, were the worst of people. To make the life of another human being nothing more than a product is pretty disgusting. Gotta love how people just always treat each other so nicely. Life for a Viking thrall was anything but pleasant, but they were a part of Viking society. We'll get to that later though.
Number 9. Hunters. Yes, a lot of Scandinavian life had domesticated animals. We wouldn't be here without that. But this isn't the time of industrial agriculture. You can't just walk into your local butcher and demand to speak to the manager when there's a lack of product. Trouble is, I think a lot of modern folks just don't know how difficult the process of hunting can be. Now, hunting is a way of R&R, a unique hobby that can give you a respect of nature and where your food comes from. Or it's a way to binge drink in a small cabin with 3 other men trying to get away from their wives. Vikings just didn't have it that easy. No catch, no food. For my taste though, in a time before gunpowder and rifles, stick to the small animals. Trying to take down a bear with arrows, that just can't be easy.
Number 8. Shipbuilders. Vikings got around. All around. Not just Europe, but a large part of the known world. Even discovering places all by themselves. They were experts at building boats. They had dragon ships, gnars, merchant ships, and a whole bunch of other kinds of water vehicles. But the most famous of all their ships would be their longboats. They used longboats to travel the world and to go on their famous vacations when they would go Viking. The dudes responsible for building these things are also responsible for the nightmares they gave all the monks and soldiers who lived in England and other European countries, assuming they survived. Imagine, it's a nice, crisp morning. You're just waking up for the long day ahead of you. You step outside to take it all in. Oh, what's that in the distance? A large, flat-bottomed oak boat with the head of a serpent or a dragon, with 50 to 60 large, hairy, sweaty, angry-looking men who are coming to put you in the ground or kidnap you, take your stuff, and burn your house to the ground? You know who you have to thank for this? Yeah, it's the Viking shipbuilder.
Number 7. Blacksmith. Being a blacksmith is a very difficult task. Red hot iron, hammers striking and forging the metal that makes our lives possible. Sure, we don't use them as much as we did in the past, but someone's gotta make horseshoes. Shout out to all the equine lovers out there. I see you. The point I'm getting to here is that in a time before power hammers and modern techniques, it's a long process. Takes time and skill. Some might even call blacksmithing an artisan craft, especially since a lot of the things that required a blacksmith to be a blacksmith, like making swords obviously, and shields and spears, but you gotta think about everything else. Door hinges, iron fittings, bolts, brackets. It's an important job in the Iron Age. What's messed up is how dangerous it is. Anyone working with metal will tell you how rough that can be. In a time before hospitals, burn treatments, and antibiotics, I would be careful on the grind wheel.
Number 6. Settlers. Life in the Scandinavian countries was not easy. Summers were like 2 days long, and winters would last so long Andrew could actually move his box over to finish filming on time.
Hey!
A large percent of the Vikings were farmers, but the soil there was not good. So, as more and more Vikings were born and families grew, some people decided to jump ship and move away. Or try to. They'd show up in England like, "Hi, so I know we kinda just like totally raided you or whatever, but we would love your land and we're gonna settle here, okay? Cool." This was usually met with the pointy end of a 3-foot sword. They would settle in areas like Britain, the Netherlands, Germany, France, Spain, Portugal, and Russia. Some successfully, some not so much. They did successfully settle Iceland and Greenland though, with their population in Iceland reaching like 50,000. When they went to Vinland, otherwise known as Newfoundland, they settled for about 5 minutes before the Native Americans drove them out. Being a settler back in the time of the Viking was a necessity for some, but a death wish for most.
Number 5. The bone grubber. Heading to the Victorian era, a classic time to be grossed out by everything in sight. More than fair. The Great Stink? Oh god. Victorian cities back in the day had this huge scavenging economy. I'll get more of that later on in this list, but the bone grubber, this was unique. This was a unique role in history. These workers would scavenge rotting bones from butchers or garbage piles, wherever leftover meat was disposed and then animals hadn't got to them yet. That's where we're heading here. To then later on sell them to dealers. Ideally the bones would be made into toothbrush handles or teething rings, anything really. Creativity was booming, I guess. The rest would go into soap making. Yeah, it was just melted and then just put on you and everywhere. So if you have any bones, hey, reach out, there you go. We'll DIY it up in the comments. Number 4, fullers. Urine was used by ancient Romans to whiten their smile. Awesome. They also used urine to wash their clothes. This isn't news. They didn't use soap back then because the amount of ammonia in urine just often did the trick, so yeah, and also it's free. Why not? Lye was also used to clean clothes at the time, but it was pricey, so plan B was to head down to the old laundromat and hand over your dirties to a fuller. Yeah, these lucky lads would have to stand in a tub filled with chemicals, water, and you guessed it, lots of urine. So much. Urine collected from all over the town, if I might add. Not just, one dude, hey, I'm saving up. No, if you've got it, bring it. Bring over the They would then scrub and stomp out all of the yuck. And then it would get in your mouth and splash up in your eyes. Horrible. Meaning most of the time, they were getting quite sick. Yeah, dangerous and disgusting job. Number 3, resurrectionalist. Alright, shout out to all the vampires watching. Nice, this one's for you. Hit that thumbs up. Dracula. A resurrectionalist was responsible for digging up dead bodies, and then they would later sell them to medical schools. This was the late 1820s, and at this time in Edinburgh, Scotland, the medical science community was changing history. It was on the up and up, it was inclining. But in order to study new medicines to, avoid the next plague, they needed these guys, sadly. I'll tell you who they didn't need though, William Burke and William Hare. Yeah, these Irish brothers were both resurrectionalists, in quotes, who were running out of patients, so they themselves would go and take people out and then proceed to sell their bodies right after. They did this 17 times. They killed 17 people all in the course of 2 years. They sold all their corpses to Dr. Robert Knox. It took 17 killings before somebody caught on. This is horrible. Even when there's no system in the works, this job is still nasty. You know what I mean? Remember dissecting that frog in high school? This is like, you don't even want to know. It's way worse, way worse. Number 2, tushers. This was one of the worst jobs back in the day, and it wasn't even legal. Yeah, double the fun, there we go. Early 19th century London, a little more modern here, but worth a mention. These tushers would spend all their time in the sewers below London just trying to find coins or valuables, anything that's been accidentally washed or forgotten. That's how hard it was finding work back then. You had to climb into sewers to hopefully find some old earrings, maybe. Just searching for scrap metals, anything really that nobody else wants to go down and claim. Now sometimes it was worth the plunge. A lot of these folks would make around $20,000 a year. But then again, a lot of them wouldn't. They would just go down, find nothing, get sick, and that's the end. Horrible stuff. And finally, number 1, rat catchers. As the name hint towards, rat catchers are one of the worst jobs you can have in a castle. It's an important role, of course, like being a fool or a walking, talking toilet. There needs to be a chasseur de rats, right? There has to be some rat guy. Back in those times, rats and mice were the leading source of spreading disease. And with these castles being dark and spooky and ominous, and you have to walk through and do this a lot, there are probably plenty of rats below, crawling around your feet. You wouldn't even see them. Black rats were a common household problem, so in comes the well-respected rat catcher. Just catching all those rats. These guys would sometimes try and use spells to get rid of the rats. Yeah, that's hilarious. That's hilarious. Like your Doctor Strange trying to do a spell, all the rats just plunge out of the sewers. If it worked, I'd shit my pants. But more often than not, that didn't work, so poison powders were the main trick of the trade for a rat catcher. The Pied Piper, he was an OG. He did musical numbers, pests came out, people were moving around. It was good. No one does it like him.
Number 10, train engine cleaner. Ever wanted to get inside a small hole in the engine of a train and shovel out the coal that was left in there? Ever wanted to go underneath a train where you can't fully stand up in the middle of the night and rake out a dusty ash pan, getting all kinds of ash and stuff in your mouth? Perfect! you can go join up with the railroad as a train engine cleaner. These guys would spend their days shoveling 5 to 6 tons of coal into the furnace of the steam trains, and then spend their nights climbing into said furnace, cleaning it out, and then going out in the middle of the freezing cold, wet night into a trench covered in water and oil and dust, and get right up under that sucker and pull out all the ashes and dust and crap that came out of the engine while it had been running all day. Number 9. Linker boy or linker men. Before the introduction of gas lights on the streets of London, the only gaslighting came in the form of small children who made you believe that you wouldn't be able to walk the streets without them tagging along with a torch to help guide your way. Then they'd expect a tip from you. Little rascals. They weren't so bad. They were generally pretty helpful in getting you from point A to point B while being able to see one foot in front of the other. And their charge was usually just 1 farthing, or the equivalent of a quarter. The linker boy, like a lot of the jobs on this list, was actually featured in a lot of art and literature from the time, and there were even some rather infamous ones, like Lawrence Casey, who was the personal linker boy for the courtesan Betty Careless. Oi! Where you going, mate? You forgot to like and subscribe to the channel. Oh, and while I've got your attention, why not take a little peek over at our Facebook, where you'll find behind the scenes content. Get on with it! Alright, bloody hell. Number 8. Knock her up. No, not like that. God. Look. I despise my alarm clock. It wakes me out of my deeply deserved beauty sleep at 6 AM every weekday morning. Now take the alarm clock and assign that job to a real person. That person is a knocker up, a person employed to wake up workers at mills and factories on early shifts, going from house to house using a long pole to knock on bedroom windows. In other words, a person employed to become the epitome of all my hatred in this world. If you had this job, well, you're not alive anymore, but I hate you. The people at the time were somewhat friendlier than they are now, and I'm sure the knocker-upper wasn't a horrible person, but I'm sure there had to be some grumpy gills who would put their hand on your chest for doing this to them. Number 7, a phrenologist. I think if this YouTube thing doesn't work out for me, I'm gonna go and make up a science. It worked for phrenologists. They claimed that a person's personality, character traits, and abilities could all be figured out by bumps and indents on a person's skull. Characteristics like secretiveness, amativeness, conjugality, and combativeness were apparently controlled by areas of the brain that they called organs of the brain. The idea was dismissed by the church, but it nonetheless gained traction through Europe and was really popular in the States. The idea that you could modify these organs through self-control and practice sounded really good to self-help gurus at the time, if only it was real. Number 6, a dog whipper. Looking for someone who absolutely despises dogs and doesn't mind being despised by the rest of us. Otherwise known as a dog whipper. Back in the day, huntsmen would often hunt foxes and nail their tails to church doors, which would attract dogs of the streets. You'd also have churchgoers who would bring their dogs with them to church. These dogs were not allowed in though, so they'd all have to wait outside. You know how dogs are though. They didn't just sit there waiting patiently. I'm sure some good boys and girls did, but more often than not they'd be playing and sometimes fighting, disrupting the church services. Enter the dog whipper, who was armed with tongs to grab a dog and remove it from the church grounds, and a whip that would be used on the loudest of the poor pooches.
In our number 5 spot today, we have the executioner. We've all heard of this job before. After all, an important aspect of the medieval times was the fact that they were trying to have better criminal law enforcement, which naturally meant that a ton of people were getting executed for their crimes. While there is of course now the stereotype of people who did this work as being these huge, hooded, evil people, history shows that this stereotype is largely untrue. Most of the people who fell into this job didn't come into it because they wanted to. In fact, most people of course saw this job as being undesirable, but the job usually was bestowed upon them. Sometimes butchers were called for the job because of relevant experience, other times it was criminals who could either do the job or face their own death sentence, and most commonly, people found themselves in the job because their fathers had been executioners before them. Aside from the nitty-gritty of the job, I mean the horrors of the work itself, it's obvious, another part of being an executioner that sucked was the fact that people didn't really want to associate with you. Executioners were usually on the fringes of society and outcast, sometimes even forced to actually live on the edge of town. In our number 4 spot today we have catgut. Back in the medieval times, they didn't have the technology we have now, or even the technology that was available in the 17th century when it came came to making strings for instruments such as the violin, but they still did have violins around, so how? Well, in comes the invention of catgut, which thankfully is not made of cat guts, but it is made of sheep's guts. Okay, really had you in the first half there. Violin string makers during this time would make the strings by basically twisting strands of sheep innards together. Their job would require them to butcher the animal in a very careful way, making sure not to rupture the stomach or the lower intestines. The process could take hours just to get the required materials from the animal. The insides then needed to be soaked in a wood ash solution for a good cleaning, but they needed to be monitored at all times to ensure that they weren't beginning to spoil, which is horrible. From here, the drying process began, and after that, it was time for twisting. In our number 3 spot today, we have the rat catcher. Another job that really is just what it sounds like. Rat catchers had quite a busy time during the medieval times. There was a rat problem, and these rats were filthy and full of disease, and someone needed to catch them. Castles were often filled with extra grain, vegetables, and herbs in the case of emergency, and this led to the perfect environment for rats and mice. Even before the connections were drawn between rats and disease, people hated them, and this is because they would eat your food. A bad rat infestation for a person without much actually could have been a death sentence for them during this time. This meant that people really appreciated rat catchers in society, although the job wasn't a great one, was clearly risky, and also was largely ineffective. Rat catchers would sometimes try and use spells, sometimes they would use herbs as a sort of poison, and sometimes they'd even use the good old leave the body as a warning to the other rats trick. Yeah, wonder why it didn't work. In our number 2 spot today, we have the treadmill operator. This is a job that sucked during the medieval times because it was boring, it's basically like a human hamster wheel, but also because it was incredibly dangerous and not for those who were afraid of heights. Treadmill operators would normally be placed at the highest point of a structure, and the wheel they were stepping on was the top half of like a pulley system to help things be hoisted up as they were building said, structure that they're at the top of. This is a practice that started in ancient Rome and was reintroduced in the Middle Ages. This was actually a job that was commonly given to people who were blind because the fear of heights dissuaded a lot of people from doing this job, which only makes it probably more dangerous. In our number 1 spot today, we have the lime burner. Lime mortar has been a common and important building material for years, stemming back to the 1st century BC, but despite its importance, it's not exactly easy to work with. In order to use it, you need to remove the carbon monoxide from the calcium-rich stone, and this was the job of a lime burner. They needed to take the stone and heat it in a kiln at around 800 degrees Celsius. Sounds easy enough for sure, except for the fact that the job meant that you were constantly being exposed to rooms full of carbon monoxide and dust chalk that was capable of removing your ability to breathe. And also, just to top it all off, there's also a high risk that once the stone was done heating, it might also explode if it comes into contact with water. So
at number 10, water carrier. These days, we have it so easy. We have the internet at our disposal to learn about pretty much anything, we have cars to get us from point A to point B, and all of our resources are close by. We get food from the grocery store and water from the taps in our houses. But back in the Middle Ages, things were a lot tougher for people, and they had to go through a lot just to get basic life necessities, like water for example. Getting water to people wasn't as easy as you might have thought, and so that's why getting water became a whole profession. In a medieval city, you lucked out depending on the area that you lived in. If you lived close to a river or stream, then you could get all the water you wanted and pretty easily too. But if you weren't so lucky to live near this resource, then you might have had to hire a water carrier to fetch it for you. People sought out strong young men to become water carriers for them, and as the name implies, they would get paid to go to the nearest source of water and bring it back for their employer. This profession became pretty popular in the late medieval period in London, and by this time so many people were working as water carriers that they created their own fraternity. At number 9, town crier. I'm sure you've heard of the town crier at some point in your life, right? They're often incorporated into pop culture pieces that take place in the medieval times. When you think of the town crier, you might also think of the famous hear ye that is associated with the speeches of the town criers. Back in the Middle Ages, the role of the town crier was a very important one, as it was a crucial way for the local authorities to communicate with the residents of their community. The town crier would often often make announcements of new laws, royal proclamations, the start of events, and even the punishments of criminals. They were basically the news anchors of the past. Also, as I mentioned, we normally associate the town crier with the phrase "hear ye," but the phrase first started off as "oye, oye, oye," which later evolved into the phrase that we are more familiar with. Before we carry on talking about these strange jobs from back in the days of old, why not take a moment to leave a like on this video if you're enjoying it so far, and while you're at it, consider subscribing to the channel to see more videos like this one. At number 8, scribe. These days, most people know how to read and write. It's part of our basic education and is one of the first things that we are taught as kids in school. As we progress in society, basic literacy is taught more and more throughout the world, as some people in parts of the world might not have access to this privilege, but back in medieval times, most of the population was illiterate, which made the roles of scribes so crucial. Not everyone had access to the right education, but for those who did and could read and write, they often became scribes. The role of the scribe was as straightforward as the name predicts. Essentially, their job was to write. Scribes were hired to write all kinds of documents ranging from letters to business contracts. One of their hardest jobs though was to copy manuscripts, which was a job that may have taken a scribe several months to complete. Many men and women in monasteries held jobs as scribes, but for common folk in villages, being able to become a scribe was seen as highly valuable as well. At number 7, reeve. These days we have elected officials in our communities who serve as a sort of voice of the people. Back in the Middle Ages, they sort of had someone similar to that, and they were called reeves. The reeve was something of a local administrator, and their job was to oversee the day-to-day running of a manor, as well as to solve disputes between the peasants. The reeve was a peasant too, but they were normally elected by their neighbors or chosen specifically by a lord, and served as a reeve for a 1-year period. This job eventually faded away as the feudal system began to decline, but fun fact, you can still find some reeves in parts of Canada. At number 6, peddler. This next job from the Middle Ages is one that we kind of still have these days, just a little more modern. We're talking about peddlers. You know how there are people who go door to door trying to sell you something, like back in the day when Avon used to do house calls? Well, this was essentially what peddlers did. Their job was to travel from village to village to sell various goods. This was how a lot of people in more remote areas were able to buy certain items. The peddler's job was pretty important for the local economy because it was able to bring business to larger areas than just one local town. It seemed like a good enough job, but socially speaking, peddlers were always looked at with suspicion. Oftentimes, local people would accuse peddlers of being criminals. Now, they easily could have been criminals, but it's really a case-by-case situation. You can't judge someone for just trying to get their coin.
Number 5, the mudlark. This is the scavenger of scavengers. The Victorian era was a very interesting time, and it was very tough to be a poor citizen. It's tough to be poor anytime, but especially back then. That's why mudlarks existed, not your average day-to-day paycheck. The mudlarks would comb the streets, riverbanks, canals for, well, anything of value. Which back then was a lot of stuff. I mean, there were doctors constantly looking for subjects to run tests on, like a science fair gone wrong. The mudlarks would often walk and walk some more in hopes of finding anything, sometimes even barefoot because, well, yeah, they were poor too, and in need of a little help themselves. This meant that they were often knee-deep in occupational hazards like sewage, freezing water, rats, bodies, bones, and anything else that you can imagine nobody wanted. Yeah, not good. Number 4, a sewer technician. It's a dirty job, but somebody's gotta do it. Today, modern sewers are tunnels and intertwining, well, tunnels that lead our least desirable filth to their final destination, whether that be the ocean or hopefully a purification plant. There's one near me. Sometimes, however, especially in older cities that haven't been equipped with the proper upgrades, these sewer lines can get clogged or jammed. Happens more than you think, actually. And when that happens, you don't call the Ghostbusters. Venkman's not gonna help you here. You call the sewer technicians. Their job is simple: maintain the sewers and unclog the holiness that awaits them below. Imagine a whole city's worth of filth that gets flushed down the porcelain throne. And seriously guys, stop flushing wipes down the toilet. They're not flushable. Don't do it, it's bad. But yeah, they go and unclog it and then everything's good, and I hope they have a nice hot shower waiting for them because boy, they need it. That's not good, they need it. Number 3, hoarder cleaner. It's a tough situation and it's a really tough job. Hoarding disorder affects thousands worldwide. It's a mental disorder that causes severe distress, anxiety, and fear when the thought of even parting with a mundane item, eventually causing an unhealthy literal pile of stuff in the home that affects the person's mental and physical health. It's a bad situation. If you've ever seen that show on TLC, you know how gross it can get. Seriously, it's bad. Animal corpses, human refuse, and a collection of McDonald's toys that you forgot about. Everyone's got some of those. Well, when these places need cleaning out, someone has got to come over and do it. Gloves, respirators, hazmat suits, they got it all to get yelled at for trying to throw out piles of garbage, which the person can't help, but it's just like I said, it's a bad situation, man. Tough job. You're cleaning up poo-poo, and you get yelled at for cleaning up poo-poo. It's not a good time. Number 2, the rat catcher. The Industrial Revolution literally changed the fabric of society. Now there's lots of factories where people would clock in and clock out for a steady wage, whilst enjoying their position in the workforce producing goods and products at an unknown level. Previously known, that makes sense, sure. But this also meant that cities got bigger, streets got more crowded, and that meant lots of rats living and loving it in that filth. That's why there were rat catchers, because there were so many rats. It was more than a problem, it was honestly an epidemic. The catcher would rub oil and thyme on himself to try and catch the rats with their bare hands, where then they would then be released elsewhere, but that kind of doesn't really... You gotta not do, because they'll come back. It's not a good solution. Number 1, the crime scene cleaner. I don't think I could ever do this. This is bad. It's all fun in primetime television when the cool detective takes off his sunglasses and makes a very low-hanging fruit pun about the crime scene he's standing in, followed by some super level DNA lab work and someone hacking a mainframe. Oh, it's all great. What great television. But someone has to clean that up in the real world. After all, if there wasn't someone to clean up those crime scenes, motels across America wouldn't have any rooms to rent out. But yes, there are people that do clean them, and yes, it's gross, and yes, I'll pass out if I talk about blood, so no more thanks.
Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have the leech collector. This job truly is exactly what it sounds like. It's a person who is responsible for the collection of leeches. The little bloodsuckers were a popular treatment back in medieval times when just bleeding was a common treatment for a variety of ailments. Headache? Just bleed a bit. Common cold? Have I got a solution for you? Bloodletting, especially by way of leech, was actually used medicinally for thousands of years with possible ties to ancient Egypt. This medical treatment, however, of course, required leeches, which meant that someone needed to collect them. Many leech collectors were people who didn't have a lot of money, and more commonly, women. The job required wading in the water and searching for leeches, and how do you catch them? With your legs, of course. Leech collectors would wait for leeches to latch onto them, and normally would have to wait for about 20 minutes before pulling them off because they were easier to remove after getting fat with blood. How horrible. This already sounds awful, but what's worse is that after being bitten by a leech, the wounds tend to bleed more than a normal cut even would. This was great to get more leeches interested, but bad as a human who is trying to keep blood inside of their body. This job usually led to those who did it to contract illnesses from the leeches, their open wounds, or just have severe blood loss because at the time, people didn't know you could overdo it with bloodletting this way. In our number 9 spot today, we have the fuller. Wool is a clothing staple. It's been used for centuries, but back in medieval times, there was a disgusting part of the job that thankfully doesn't exist anymore, thanks to the invention of modern chemistry. Wool is naturally waterproof due to the fact that it contains oils that have been distributed from the sheep's skin, and these oils are what made the entire harvesting, carding, spinning, and weaving processes possible in these times. This is all fine and well, but the trouble comes in after all of that, because the cloth at the end of it all was coarse and easily frayed, and this is where the job of a fuller came in. They were tasked with removing the oil from the cloth. Okay, a little alkaline solution, no problem, right? Well, yeah. Except for in these times, the most accessible and cheap alkaline solution was stale urine. Yep, just a bunch of old pee. A fuller had to take this new woven material, put it into a tub full of old pee from who knows where, and then you stomp on it with your feet. And then you get no shower at the end of it either. What's a carpenter without his tool belt, right? What I mean is that fullers were also responsible for collecting their own pee to use for the wool, so they often needed to head to all the local public toilets and private homes to collect it. Just gets worse. In our number 8 spot today, we have the groom of the stool. This job doesn't sound too bad with just the title. It weirdly sounds kind of regal. I mean, it was quite a prestigious position during this time, but it also was one of the most humiliating jobs in history. In the medieval times, kings were looked on almost as if they were gods. You know, it's their divine right. And because of this divine right, for centuries, it was deemed improper for a king to wipe his own behind after using the facilities. This is where the groom of the stool comes in. This high-level noble nobleman would be responsible for fetching the toilet chair for the king when nature called, and he would also be in charge of the wiping aspect of the whole thing. No bidets, I guess, back then. The groom of the stool also played a role in monitoring the king's health, as he was tasked with examining the stool just to watch for any serious changes. And should the king be having some digestive troubles at any point, the groom of the stool would always be nearby and ready to administer a royal enema. In our number 7 spot today, we have the nightman. This is definitely one of the shittiest jobs from the medieval times, and I mean that quite literally. Also referred to as gong farmers, these people had the unfortunate job of cleaning out all of the human waste from the cesspits in the castle walls, which they would then transport to a pre-arranged location where it would be buried. These cesspits were the medieval equivalent to a septic tank, and they were usually located on the lowest level of the castle. The nightmen would end up digging through weeks, months, just sometimes even years of disgustingness, and they were motivated to gather as much as possible considering the fact that they were paid by the ton. Imagine, that's a frightening amount of work. The job was also quite hazardous, too. I mean, if we really think about what exactly they were doing, it quickly becomes clear that many of them died from disease, and there was also a good chunk of people who suffocated on the job as well. In our number 6 spot today, we have a sin eater. Okay, this is definitely one of the strangest jobs on this list. The job of a sin eater was to, well, eat sins. To do this, they were tasked with eating a piece of bread that had been placed on the chest of someone who had died. Definitely not an ideal day of work for me personally. The idea behind this was that in consuming the bread, they were consuming the sins of that person so that they could carry on into the afterlife peacefully. Basically, sin eaters were willing to sacrifice their own souls and their own eternal happiness just to make some money while they were alive. I'm not sure what's worse, taking the risk with the sins or eating bread from off of a dead person. No, both bad.
And speaking of Christianity, how about a church position called the Sluggard Wakers, which is quite the name. Guess the only thing worse for the church's holy sanctuary than dangerous stray dogs was the presence of conked out parishioners. Sluggard Wakers were volunteers that patrolled the pews and ensured that none of the congregation was falling asleep when they should be praising their Lord. They were literally Jesus snitches. If you were caught dozing off during the service, the Sluggard Waker had the sacred duty to wallop you on the head, and not lightly. The sleeper usually clobbered with something like a club, a rod, or a switch bundle. Some of the more aggressive Sluggard Wakers used forks or brass-tipped staffs or metal knobs to do the job. The sting of rebuke was supposed to wake you and remind you to remain awake and vigilant for your Lord. Jesus wasn't sleeping on you, now is he? No. Some Sluggard Wakers were volunteer members of the congregation. Some Wakers were members of the church staff, such as the parish clerk. Other Wakers were also knock-nobblers, because when there were no dogs to drive off, there were likely congregants to wake up. I should probably explain all the dogs in church talk I'd be doing, so knock-nobblers are next. Medieval Europeans lived in filth. Their structures all sucked, and so did their economy. Does it really surprise you that the church would just have its doors wide open? Does it really surprise you if they didn't have windows? Of course animals can get in, so knock-nobblers had the unique task of chasing wild dogs out of the church to protect the congregation, especially the priest who's most at risk while holding the full loaves of bread for service. Elderly men holding warm loaves of bread were probably some very easy prey for a hungry, unscrupulous wild dog. And as someone who survived being mauled by a dog, the terrifying reality is once they're on you, it can be incredibly difficult to get them off. So this job would actually be super necessary. Always remember, protect the face and neck. So a nobble knocker was given a whip and a pair of dog tongs. The whip was used just to scare the dogs away. The tong was used to clasp the animal from a safe distance so they could be removed from property. Their methods and ideology were the precursors to modern animal control departments and their tools. Knock-nobblers didn't stop there though. If wild dogs weren't running around, they would instead turn their attention to unruly and disobedient children. If scolding didn't work, the knock-nobbler would remove the child from service too. The amount of avoidable child screaming I've heard at a synagogue? Yo, I feel like we should just bring this back. I love this job. Before the phone book, the pocket book, a BlackBerry, or even gasp, Apple, was the nomenclator. We all know the person, or are the person, who cannot remember names or dates to save their literal life. If that is the case, you'd be better suited hiring one of these guys rather than working as one. Nomenclators were serfs tasked with remembering other people's names, status, and important impressive details for their lords at public events. This way you aren't carrying a quill and parchment around for reference, and imagine how much more impressive it is for the fair damsels that you remember her address and her father's companies just like that. Or well, at least the dude standing next to you does for you, but whatever. Sometimes the nomenclator's job would be hiked up a notch and they would have to remember more information for their master because homeboy got drunk or zooted. This could be details from prior conversations, plans to meet someone somewhere, things they've lied about and now you have to upkeep for them. Even just basic information about the individuals your master has been speaking to throughout the evening. Essentially, nomenclators were phone books before it was cool and embarrassment prevention babysitters. No better thing to title it, so let's just call it by its name, Piss Prophet. The Piss Prophet, also called a water scriger because oh, that's so much better, was a doctor who diagnosed disease from the sight, smell, and taste of a patient's urine. This term seems to originate from the 1600s, but the profession itself dates back to the medieval era. Now, I gotta play devil's advocate a little bit because scientifically this isn't quite as insane as it sounds. Some conditions can really be diagnosed with urine alone, such as diabetes, which makes urine sweet. And as we would all know, dehydration causes strong, dark colored urine, and UTIs can leave blood in urine. If you and I can recognize at least two of those things from sight without our doctor present, it's not totally gross that they give it a little dip and a lick. And now we're cutting the crossroads. Hey, so wanna hear a fun sentence? Samurai sometimes tested swords by attacking random passerbys. Yeah, so in medieval Japan, it was considered dishonorable if a samurai sword couldn't cut through an opponent's body in one stroke. It was important then for a samurai to know about the quality of his weapon, so every new sword he got had to be tested before he took into battle. Naturally, it's gotta be a realistic test too. So samurai mostly practiced this through and through cut style on corpses or on criminals. That's normal, kinda what you would expect, but corpses need to be whole in their culture, so not many people wanted to just offer theirs up for the chop chop. And well, Japan has some efficient execution methods that were a lot more painful and slow for the criminals and taught the public a lot more. So you would never guess what the method was lined up to fill that void instead, and somehow legally approved, condoned, and excused as a ceremonial way to go. Sujigiri translated means crossroad killing because the targets were random everyday commoners who were minding their own business and happened to need to walk through an intersection at night the way that we all do at some point. And samurai would quite literally chop these people down. Bodies would be found by others or in the early morning, and there was never anyone to blame, and you technically couldn't be angry or seek revenge. This was government approved and sanctioned activity. Incidents of sujigiri were rare in the early medieval period, but began to pick up in the 1200s when more sociopathic or psychopathic samurai started to, pun intended, overkill it. By the Warring States period, the end of the medieval era, sujigiri became a dishonorable act. Samurai and kabukimono rogues turned it into a horrific popular pastime. In fact, one Edo era report from the year 1600 details the early years of the period, claiming that people were killed in sujigiri every night on certain crossroads in what's now modern day Tokyo. This continued to escalate, so the authorities felt they had to ban it in 1602, only a few decades after the medieval period finally ended. I do want to start off with something that may be somewhat of a familiar career, so we're going to start with chariot riders. It goes without saying that people don't really remember that there's places outside of Europe when it comes to the medieval ages, and they never come up in conversation. The Byzantine Empire had existed since 395, and it ended when the medieval era did in 1453. And one high-paced, action-packed, yet wildly dangerous job that was flexing the great wealth and progress of the empire was chariot racing, which differed from modern horse racing or even NASCAR racing. You were exposed, the chariots had no backs, and you were standing without any seatbelts or restraints to keep you from flying off. You could be smashed against the stone pillars, dragged to your death behind your own horses. The appeal of racing for the fans appeared to be the same as the modern fans: testosterone, adrenaline, bloodshed, and gambling. Racers, meanwhile, had the potential for a fortune and their freedom, because that's what made the job suck. Its chariot riders weren't free men, and knowing you could win 15 bags of gold, yeah, you're gonna kill any other racer who tries to get in your way, because if you lose, you're just going back to hard labor. There were 4 teams in the Byzantine chariot racing: the whites, the greens, the blues, and the reds. Eventually these teams merged and it just became the greens and the blues, and the fans were so passionate about the sport that when they weren't throwing nail-studded tablets under the track to sabotage opponents, they were breaking into bloody brawls to support their own team. And now, on the complete flip side, in primitive medieval Europe, a job called flatulist. As someone who reads and writes about history all day, every day, I really do have a hard time with how the Europeans got so high and mighty and dubbed everyone else primitive when they literally lived like it was the New Jersey's public landfill and had the humor to match. So yeah, believe it or not, royals would actually employ an individual called a flatulist to entertain crowds sigh by farting. These individuals would pass gas in what they called amusing manners, such as to music or even on certain cues to get big laughs. Irish gas performers were called bracetors instead of flatulists. St. Augustine, of all people, once wrote about flatulists, saying that they possess such a command of their bowels and can break wind continuously at will, so as to produce the effect of singing. As if it couldn't get more weirdly infuriating, some flatulists were actually considered celebrities of their time. One was Roland the Farter, who performed for Henry II's court annually. After several years, Henry rewarded him with 30 acres of land, a giant manor, for his skilled entertainment. Let's hear about how these old ladies would just you're healed. In ancient and medieval Europe, a group of wise women who were mostly elderly would give insight into medical issues primarily concerning the female body that the male counterparts had yet to grasp. And some of these homeopathic healers would actually spit on young ladies 3 times in order to protect them from the evil eye. Talk about a weird job, huh? This custom of spitting opens up a wide subject. Not only is it practiced in the hope of obtaining good fortune for the spittee, but amongst all ages and almost all people, it being considered as an act to safeguard the spitter as well. According to Theocritus, amongst the ancient Greeks and Romans, the most common remedy against an invidious look was spitting. It was hence called despure malum. It is necessary to spit 3 times into the breast of the person who fears fascination. Invidious look and fascination is in reference to the evil eye. Old women were accustomed to avert the evil eye from children by spitting onto their own bosoms. And among the ancient Greeks, where this tradition even came from, it was customary to do the triple spit into your own bosom at the sight of someone with a condition or ailment you wish not to be stricken with. Leprosy, maybe they're a madman, maybe they're struggling with epilepsy. This act was done in defiance of the omen, and spitting is known to be a sign of aversion, bidding it not come into their life as it had to the individual stricken with it. These spitting grannies were some of the first women hunted because they were believed to be evil sorceresses and witches. Because if farting wasn't entertainment, animal eviscerations were. Meet the bear leaders, an unusual historical profession involving exactly what the name describes, literally leading bears from village to village. Bears were mostly used for blood sports like bear baiting, in which packs of dogs were set to fight against the bear. You can imagine how that'd go. Both Henry IV and Elizabeth I were famously fans of that horrific bloodshed, and by the Tudor era, increasing numbers of bear pits or bear gardens were constructed in major cities. Bear leaders allowed villagers to enjoy entertainment of the big city bear baiting fights in the comfort of their own homes. Incidentally, by the 18th century, the term bear leader actually came to refer to a different profession altogether. They were literally tutor and babysitter hybrids who were hired by parents to keep boisterous, young noble sons under control and out of trouble, particularly during the Grand Tour. What's that mean? Taking care of crappy noble child was the same as handling bears. So let me think. Leading bears from city to city making money in the medieval era, or raising a spoiled entitled child in an era where there's no water washing the snot off their face or the stickiness off their fingers. Bear, I'll take the bear. Can I get some bears over here? Bear, yeah. Here's one that's still a job to this day, adult adoptee. Japan's birth rate is probably worse than that of a nunnery, but they do have the 2nd largest adoption rate, 90% of which is in between 2 adult Japanese men. This is often because the older man's employee or their pre-existing son-in-law, who could then agree per contract to take the name of his now sister wife, but they can be flexible negotiators in a son search. For example, if the younger man still has his starter pack parents, the older man will happily offer those parents a buyout. If their new hand-picked son is already married, they'll also just adopt his wife as part of the package deal. Like most hardcore Japanese business practices, this weird form of feudal meritocracy can be traced back to the age of medieval samurai. For centuries, Japanese nobles would seek out competent young men to audition for who wants to be the next clan heir. And nowadays, major companies like Mitsubishi, Toyota, and Canon have actually been handed over to former CEOs adopted children. The practice of using adoption to pick the next paterfamilias was also popular with the ancient Roman nobility. An example being the first proper emperor, Augustus aka Octavian. He was only a distant relative of Julius Caesar until he was adopted in the dead dictator's will to continue the hostile takeover of Rome. But the European practice of adult adoption existed and then was wiped out by the new feudal nobility during the medieval ages. Not because they wanted to create a more competitive market for baby orphans. After all, how would the church get its free labor if not by people dropping them off on their steps? On the contrary, these Christian rulers banned adoption altogether, believing nobody deserves to be part of a good family unless they slid into that privilege on a wave of nepotism and discarded placenta.
Number 5. Fletcher. I used to be an adventurer like you until I took an arrow to the knee. Somebody had to make these bad boys. Archery. It was an important part of medieval life. Just look at the longbowmen of England. They'll tell you. Bows and arrows may not be the first thing you think of when talking about Vikings, but judging from text, art, and other evidence suggests that archery played a major role in Viking life. Chances are, if you saw a longboat coming into your shores, there would be some burly blonde-haired dudes with bows ready to find their targets. There's a part of me that thinks this is one time the player can blame the controller, or the arrows for that matter. Not every arrow is going to be perfect, so if something goes wrong, you can go back to base and yell at Youngrold.
Number 4. Law speaker. So, in Viking life there were some rules and laws that applied to all Vikings, and some that were specific to each village or town. But they didn't have law books. There wasn't any kind of written law at all. No, instead, one lad from each town would go have the special task of being the law speaker. This was one person in town who would have the lovely job of memorizing every naughty thing that the members of the village weren't allowed to do. When a council meeting, which was literally called a thing, took place, he was there to remind everyone of any law that was forgotten or to listen and memorize new laws that were made. Then he would waltz on down to the village law rock and recite that law to everyone who was not part of the thing. Now, imagine if you forgot a law, or if you worded it differently and that caused someone to find a loophole, or imagine if you were someone who the law speaker didn't like. That guy could mess up your whole day. If the punishment for a crime was not death, it was sure damn close enough, being exiled into the cold, harsh wilderness. Look, the Vikings came into contact with enough cultures who made a habit of writing things down. Get with the program.
Number 3. Thrall. Hey, I don't like it. Nobody likes it. It's YouTube's least favorite S word, forced manual labor, or you know what I'm talking about. Vikings were kind of twisted in that department, honestly. Like Adam said, sometimes for fun, they take you away for some good old-fashioned manual labor. Also, like Adam said, this was a very successful and profitable business strategy. If there weren't laws that made employers pay a minimum wage, well, I'd hate to see a world without those laws, you know what I'm saying? It's a terrible thing to find yourself in. While there were some sort of sick buyback freedom program going on, the thrall system does echo with serfdom in the rest of Europe, which if you look around isn't around anymore, probably for good reason.
Number 2. Traders. Vikings weren't just mindless brutes who would run around plunging their axes and swords into people, getting drunk and wearing little to no clothing. I mean, yes, there was a fair share of that, but they were also very handy, excellent craftsmen and explorers. As they grew, some towns became trading centers, importing and exporting goods from lands far away. Through Russia, Vikings came into contact with Chinese and Persian traders who gave them spices and fine silks and amber. They would barter with things like weapons, furs, walrus ivory, and fish. They managed to get wine from France and Germany. But while these Vikings decided to trade in the danger of robbing for a more diplomatic profession, they still had to travel. And while they may be making hella bank, that doesn't really matter when you and your longboat carrying all your goods ends up at the bottom of the ocean. Like we said earlier in the video, Vikings were amazing boat builders, but they were not masters of the elements. And if Thor decides it's time for a storm, or if pirates got you in their sights, you gotta deal with the consequences.
Number 1. Beekeeping. I'll admit it, I may be a cute husky guy who reminds people of other overweight comedians. I love Candy and Farley too, and maybe sometimes I fart too much. But as it turns out, I have some fears too. I know, who would have thought? One thing I'm not cool with is flying insects, especially the ones that can hurt you. I don't like those ones. Bees and wasps, ironic, I know, my little honeybees, I know, right? Who would have thought? I've never been stung before and I don't plan on it. With my luck, Adam's a supervillain with thousands of bees at his disposal. Who knows? With all jokes aside, the Vikings had honey, which probably means they had some sort of beekeeping going on. We're not sure, however, how they did it. What I do know, though, is that they had no protection or smoke blowers. Maybe they did. Tell you what, I'll enjoy the honey and let the crazy burly men take care of the harvesting.
Starting our list off at number 10, a banker. Today, online banking is easy, right? It's a little bit too invasive at times. I don't know. I get an email from my bank. It's like, Mr. McWaters, do you want to provide for your family? I'm like, chill, relax. Back in the Old West, you didn't get a courtesy check-in email. You didn't have overdraft. In fact, the United States national banking system, well, it didn't even exist until 1863. Before then, you'd have what were called wildcat banks. And, well, these were pretty fun. Here we go. What they would do is wildcat banks, they would take deposits for a short amount of time, collect your life savings, and then unannounced randomly, they would disappear overnight. Just take all your money and then run for the woods. How horrible is that? Imagine going to the bank the next day and it's gone. The bank's just not there. You're standing there with a card. Like, hello? Where did I put this in? You're telling me they pretended to be bankers for months at a time? Fake mustache, oh hello sir, good morning. Stamping things that aren't even real. They did all of that and then they just ran away with all of your money. That's wild. I get it now. I get it. The Wild West. After 1863, a noble profession was to work at a bank, you know, and not screw people over for thousands of dollars. The Hudson Bay Company, Wells Fargo, these are all names that began because of these fake Looney Tune wildcat banks. So next time you see your bank call, be thankful. Don't be stressed, be thankful. They've got your back. They're not gonna run away overnight. Number 9, ranch work. Alrighty, I can't do yard work. I don't know if you can tell by my physical being, but I can't lift a brick. My back doesn't allow me to reach the floor. A weird curve in the back, I don't know. Pulling weeds physically hurts my soul. Or maybe I'm just lazy. One of the two, I don't know. Either way, the Old West would have been the end of Taylor McWaters. To be a cowboy, it meant lots and lots of ranch work. It wasn't all yees and haws and kicking around. A lot of the time you were protecting your cattle. That's stressful, right? All that meat just sitting there in the 1800s, good luck. Cowboys earned between $25 to $40 a month. Yeah, which sounds laughable now, but today that would be around $1,500 a month, which is fine. I mean, for a cowboy, I don't know, it's a bit less than. Do cowboys get sick days? Probably not. They probably just get sick. Number 8, railroad work. This is one of the few jobs from the Old West that I actively see every single day coming to work. Living downtown, they're always adding trains and bridges and not finishing any of them. And ideally, you don't want any toxic substance traveling down those lines, right? Fingers crossed. Well, back in the Old West, railroads were meant to assist the booming mining and ranching industries. Thing is, there weren't enough hands. There was not enough to keep up with the rate that they needed to. Like, who's gonna build a railroad? You know, who was the first person? Railroad workers, monthly, you'd make around $1,000, and this brought a wave of immigrants to the West. The Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads, they all lay over 1,700 miles. Now, making this actual railroad, it destroyed the bodies of these workers, but without it, American history would not be the same. Couldn't imagine making a railroad. That is exhausting. Number 7, blacksmith. All right, close your eyes and imagine a blacksmith. Just any blacksmith from any time. Is he bald? Does he have a massive beard? Is he incredibly strong and wildly intimidating? Yeah, that checks out. That's what a lot of them look like. Missing teeth, banging something pretty loud, that's a blacksmith. Frontier times were almost a golden time for blacksmiths, believe it or not. Hammers, horseshoes, new railroads, it checks out. No, they didn't need any chainmail, but a saddle wouldn't hurt, that's for sure. We could use a saddle. They would earn up to $200 a day. Blacksmiths were always busy in the Old West. They doubled as auto repair services really at the same time. I mean, I don't know. A guy comes in with a busted up carriage, well, now you're a mechanic. Yeah, go fix this wooden car. Good luck, you have one day. Here's 10 bucks. Number 6, journalism. Believe it or not, the newspaper business cleaned up shop back in the frontier. Everyone wanted to know what the tea was. Tucson, Arizona, for example, back in the day, back in 1831, that one town had 5 different newspapers. Yeah, even though there are only 465 residents, there were 5 different papers. That's stressful. How do you keep up with that much news? I mean, to be fair, before radio and television, yeah, there's probably lots to talk about all day long. That's pretty much all you can do, just talk all day long, so I get it. The industry provided jobs as well. It's very much like YouTube. Here, there's writers, there's hosts, the design and print staff, we have editors. It was a little easier than laying down a railroad, that's for sure. So when it came to jobs, yeah, journalism wasn't that bad. Definitely better than doing anything that has to do with this motion, that's for sure.
Number 5, a rat catcher. I know this will make a few of you out there squirm in your seats. Rats in Victorian England were a massive problem. They were everywhere. every nook and cranny of your house, from the basement to the pipes. There was even an account of them spilling over from royal parks. So of course, where there is a problem, there is a job. Rat catchers were pretty famous throughout the Victorian era, and were highly praised in society, but the job wasn't too glamorous. You'd be going into the dark, dirty places where rats would make their homes and catching and often killing thousands of rats a year. Often rat catchers would use other animals like dogs and ferrets to help them hunt down the rats too. I don't know though, gonna be me. Number 4, an upright worker. Upright workers, otherwise known as chimney sweeps, actually started off being children as young as the age of 4. The smaller size of the little kiddos was perfect for fitting inside and climbing up and down chimneys. The little suckers would rub their elbows and knees up against the brick of the chimney so much that they would be scraped raw before callousing. Isn't that lovely? No, it's not. It's horrible. Some children were deliberately underfed to keep them small enough to do the job. Some of them would get permanent lung damage from the dust and smut and smoke from the chimney. Some kids even got stuck in the chimneys. Thank the Lord they eventually passed a law that would make it illegal for anyone under the age of 21 to be a chimney sweep. But even then, 'tis not a profession many would like to have. Number 3, matchstick makers. The idea of a lighter wasn't really a big thing in the Victorian era. They definitely existed, as the first one was invented in 1823, but it was not exactly a portable thing. So matches were your match. The first match was invented in 1805, but it sucked. The first friction-activated match came about in 1826, and they were made with white phosphorus, which is extremely toxic. But they didn't have machines to make these matches. No, it was actually mainly done by teenage girls. And in the worst of conditions too. Forget protective gear. Oh, you want to take your lunch break away from the highly toxic white phosphorus? Oh no. That's right. These girls would have to eat their lunch at their workstations, meaning they would end up ingesting the white phosphorus. Yes, my favorite seasoning. Number 2. Resurrectionists. Back in the day, medical schools who wished to study the human body only really had access to the bodies of criminals who had hit the end of the line. There actually weren't too many of these bodies around, which led to a good price for bodies that were in reasonably good condition, other than being deceased. This wasn't exactly the greatest idea, as now you've created an opportunity for people with no morals or empathy to go and dig up fresh graves, becoming resurrectionists. A cool name for an absolutely god-awful profession, if you could call it that. The problem was bad enough that people would actually guard the graves of their recently deceased loved ones. No one should have to do that. Number 1, night soil man. Alright, if you need me, I'll be depositing my night soil over in the toilet. Poop. Night soil is poop. And the night soilman? Well, you see, before we had real sewer systems, the night soil you deposited at home would go into a lovely hole in the ground. As you can imagine, these would tend to fill up over time, and that's when you have your night soilman come in. Yes, his job was to clear out the poop deposits from houses and cart it away in the middle of the night so nobody in polite society would have to see it. But they were always in business, so that makes the job a little less crappy.
And at number 10 is jewelry making. Egyptians saw deep spiritual significance in their jewelry, but also had a love of aesthetics. And those two things combined to create some of the most unique and lavish jewelry found in history. Worn to ward off spirits, protect health, bring good luck, and more, there were even certain colors and designs that were associated to certain gods and powers. And so Egyptian jewelers followed very strict rules regarding the mystical aspects of their jewelry creations. While a woman usually would not be a metal worker in Egyptian society, it was very common for her to be making jewelry. The tools were smaller and the process required less heat and thus less danger for her. Metalwork techniques included precious metal sheets that were cut and shaped, notched together. Wire work was accomplished through strip twisting. Pieces could be held together with this wire stripping system or crimping techniques. These strips were also how link chains were accomplished, as well as the securing of beads or the backs of earrings. For jewelry designed exclusively for burial, the metal was often quite thin, as the jewelry of the deceased was not subjected to the wares of everyday life. Precious stones, ivory, real flowers, and shells were all common ornaments, as was name engravements, but it was more common with royalty. Jewelry makers were women of high status due to these contributions and the revelry jewelry held in ancient Egypt. For number 9, it's house vendors. Recognized as an ancient heritage profession, profession and was at its most popular during time periods of ancient Egypt where women were restricted from going out when married. These vendors would roam neighborhoods with buckets and baskets of product for sale: clothing, perfume, fabrics, snacks. Now, what was unusual is that the vendor was more often women than men, walking the streets alone, making these sales because many married women weren't allowed to go out walking the streets alone to make sales. You see the irony. Anyways, this profession found great popularity in single women, and many also were called upon to act as nurses in homes of the wealthy when needed. The career is named al-Dalala, but the idea itself has long been extinct with the freedom for Egyptian women to roam commercial districts. Number 8 is being a dancer. Ancient Egyptians loved their music and dance. They were celebratory, but also ritualistic at times. Farmers would dance to thank the gods for a good harvest. Dance groups would perform at banquets. People would go dance around the Nile in the lush season. The list goes on. Many men and women chose dance as a career, and it was a highly respected one. Dancing was considered an acceptable and normal part of life, and even important to it. Most festivals were incomplete without it. In fact, dancing was such a revered career that dancers could start as a peasant and become a high status person from it, just like being a celebrity in the way that people would go to see them perform. Women at the time were even more revered for their grace, elegance, and acrobatics. This career had 7 types of dance: gymnastic, movement, pair dancing, imitative dance, which was like acting like animals, group dances like a historic cheerleading squad, dramatic dance was female exclusive and rested in illustration, war dances, grotesque dance, and then religious chant dances at temples, and lyrical dance, which was usually a depiction of lovers. Wig makers are number 7. Egyptians loved wigs for a reason that surprises many. It helped keep their heads cool. I mean, it also helped with hygiene and scalp pests and looking pretty, but the heat thing is what really gets folks. Many Egyptians had shaved or cropped hair, and the mesh-like base of a wig versus a headscarf allowed the body heat to still escape. And as said, wigs were also a great shield from lice or other invasive bugs. The hair used in the construction of wigs and hair extensions was always human and was either an individual's own hair or had been traded or bought. Hair itself was a valuable commodity ranked alongside gold and incense in a count list from the town of Kahun, which puts emphasis on the popularity of wigs. When hair was collected for a wig, it was thoroughly combed and then sorted into lengths individually. The Egyptians invented a variety of hairdressing tools, and the wig makers would take the time to braid or coil the hair depending on the wig style, coating each with warm beeswax and resin fixative so that it would harden when cooled. The job itself isn't unusual, more so the booming industry it had. Wigs weren't worn to this extent anywhere else at the time, and while yes they were functional against the sun, they were more so aesthetic than anything. Individual braid and extensions could also be attached to someone's scalp for aesthetics, the way that box braids, twists, faux locks, and many other ethnic hairstyles are accomplished today. Wigs were made in a type of factory setting. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of wig factories, wig boxes have been found in tombs, and multiple mummies have been found with wigs or braided in extensions. Number 6, we meet our ladies of the night. Unlike most ancient and even modern civilizations, selling intercourse is illegal or was highly governed. In ancient Egypt, this wasn't even close to the case, but rather the opposite in a peculiar way. Women who worked in the sexual industries were considered divine and respectable, as their career was considered to please the gods. They earned high status and lived in luxury. Working freely and openly, these ladies adorned themselves with red lipstick and eye makeup that differentiated themselves from other women. They were also tattooed, diamond-shaped dots along the thighs and on the fingers or images of the god Bes. When the French invaded, they brought STIs, and they spread rapidly through the brothels, and this prompted the French authorities to introduce a law forbidding French troops from entering the brothels or having these ladies in their rooms. Guess those ladies were hard to resist, because anyone who offended the law received death penalty.
Number 5. Mining. A study done at a mine in Butte, Montana found that miners were dying from tuberculosis. A lot, like 10 times more than they should be. Not should be, but you get what I'm saying. The mining industry is crazy dangerous. Safety was often overlooked and the health of these miners was, well, non-existent at the time. The first gold rush was back in 1799. This kicked off everything. A young man named Conrad Reed, he found this bright yellow rock. He had no idea what it was, and for years, he and his father John Reed actually used it as a door stopper. Yeah, this 17-pound nugget of gold just keeping a swift breeze rolling through. It's worth a bit more than a doorstopper today, and this actually ended up changing the entire industry. Gold mining got so popular that Congress had to build the Charlotte Mint just so they could handle all this incoming gold found in North Carolina alone. It's pretty cool. You have to make a mint? That's how much money you're making? Buddy, I want a mint. Number 4, law enforcement. Of course, this too was a little different back in the Old West. There are not many body cams back then, I'll tell you that for free. Movies and television, they like to show the Old West as a lawless, rootin' tootin' time, and while sure, some of that is true, it wasn't as terrible as we think. Like A Million Ways to Die in the West, Red Dead Redemption, it wasn't that crazy because before any formal law enforcement agency did pop up, everybody was a bounty hunter, right? Why not? There's nothing else to do. Go lay a bunch of bricks or go catch a bad guy. 50-50, both are quite dangerous. Eventually, positions like that of a US Marshal began to pop up more and more, and well, now there's a bit more order to the system, that's for sure. A bit, just a little bit. Number 3, barkeep. Alright, I love pubs, big old fan of pubs. Never been to a Wild West rootin' tootin' pub, but I'm in no rush. They always have weird drinks like venom snake juice or whatever, like spider ale. I'm like, I don't want any of these poisons. How about a beer? Just a beer, thanks. Bars in the Wild West, not so fun. Not a lot of open mics going on back then in the 1800s. No karaoke night back then. See, back then, these saloons were just for business. That's it. You don't have a mustache and a business plan, get out. In the 1850s, saloons would price their drinks depending on how far away you had to travel. Can you imagine that? In the Yukon, their shot of whiskey was 50 cents a pop. Now, that was a lot back in the day, but if you were to ask for the same drink in a local saloon, say in, I don't know, Colorado, it'd be a lot cheaper. Pretty ruthless. That's rootin' tootin' ruthless. The odd time you would have poker, dice, maybe some guy in a piano with some jazz fingers, sure, but most of the time, business only. When saloons first popped up in Wyoming back in 1822, most of the time, it was only reserved for lawmen, miners, or gamblers. If you don't have any of those three, you're thirsty. Go gamble, go grab a dice and come back. Number 2, resurrectionalist. Yeah, you don't see a lot of these guys around anymore, eh? Wonder where they all went. A resurrectionalist is exactly what it sounds like. It's very gross. You're trying to bring someone back to life, I guess. Not really. These guys were responsible for digging up dead bodies, and then they would sell them to medical schools in the West. Now remind you, this was the late 1820s, so yeah, it was fine, I guess. This practice began in Edinburgh, Scotland. The medical science community was on the up and up, but in order to study new medicines, you know, to avoid the next plague or the next toxin rolling through your system, they needed these guys to come in and do the dirty work. Today the medical community is a bit different. We're a bit, you know, smarter with things, but hey, never say never. A resurrectionalist might come back to life and be a new profession. How ironic. And finally, number 1, medicinal showmen. Yes, we'll end on this note. Step right up and see something that doesn't work. A fake product. Yes, here we go. I'm doing a fake shoe. A fake shoot? A fake show. I don't know. Back in the Wild West, the 1860s to the 1890s specifically, they had what's called medicinal showmen, right? You won't believe your eyes. You have strep throat? Come on up. Here we go. Definitely gonna fix that. These guys would go town to town selling elixirs and tonics, whatever, but it was all about the pitch. That's pretty much all they had. They would have pawns, like their buddies, run ahead into town and then plant themselves in the audience before these random medicine shows. That way, when the world's greatest showman doctor arrives, he randomly picks an ill patient that he knew was there, and then boom, just like that, he's cured. Almost like a magic show, right? Some would think, full of lies. One of the most successful of these elixirs was the elixir made by John Healy and Charles Bigelow. It was a mixture of herbs, roots, and animal fat, and it was wildly popular. They toured with this elixir. They had to tell everybody in every town. They said it could treat any illness, but in reality, it was just a laxative. Just a mess. Just a show, really. So don't believe everything you hear, except for today. Today we're a bit smarter. Back then, not quite.
Number 10, farming. In a world with a lack of food, not because I ate it all, which is honestly a good reason, peasantry had to work on their farms, not only to feed the rich, but also themselves. So if the men in your household are ill or sick, then that means it's Rivet Rosie time, or Farming Fran time, whatever you want to call it. I don't need to tell any farmer out there how tough their job can be. Being a medieval woman farmer, that's tough. Also, they probably weren't allowed to wear clothing that was more suitable for plowing fields. And of course, there's a woman trying to do a man's job. How dare she? People just should have let them be. There's a good chance the crops wouldn't make it either. A green thumb would have come in very handy. A tough job nonetheless. Number 9, beer maiden. This one goes out to any woman who's ever had the pleasure of working at a certain restaurant that's fixated on women's chests. You know the one I'm talking about. Or any woman who had the absolute pleasure of working at a golf course clubhouse. Keep your mitts to yourself, you filthy animals. I can't imagine the bar maidens of ye olde times had better luck. There really aren't a lot of laws to protect them either. But basically, they helped serve ale in the taverns and inns, which brought in all kinds of unsavory types. Mind you, it's not as bad as it would be in Skyrim or, other fantasy RPGs, but it's still a sour bunch. Sometimes there were just barrels of ale and the maiden's job was to simply just keep filling the tankards and handing them out. I'm sure she was well respected and not even once ever had her personal space infringed upon, right? Of course not, no. Number 8, caring for children. Hey, someone had to do it. A woman's job is never done. At least that's what my mom, my aunt, my grandma, and pretty much every woman I've ever known has always said. Okay, sure, I was a little bit of a handful. I was loud and energetic and I loved to talk. Teachers always said I was a distraction in class. Alright, maybe I was, and maybe I still am. Okay, I am. But at least the women caring for me had the modern amenities of the 21st century. A fridge full of fresh food, washing machines, cars, and a solid structure with 4 walls. So you can imagine if you had to deal with a kid like me back in ye olde times, just with none of the nice stuff that makes life today a lot of fun. Ye olde Chetty running amok. Oh mother, mother! Number 7, the streets. Unusual to most, but very common to women of ye olde times. When you're a woman who's got nothing, sometimes you gotta give something. That something just so happens to be what's hiding in your pants. It's a profession that's as old as time, and it will not be going anywhere anytime soon. Women work the streets. I don't think that's anything to be ashamed of. Number 6, Joan of Arc. It doesn't get more unusual than the savior of France. England and France were having a go at it, if you will, which if you know history was like round 12 of 100. Anyway, it wasn't going too well for France. It was going rather poor actually. The same kind of poor I got on my report cards under the paying attention section. Oops. Then there was Joan, really a nobody, when one day she heard the voice from a higher power that she was to drive the English out of France. Naturally, the people around her, especially the men, scoffed at the thought of a young woman being the hero they needed. But given that they had nothing to lose, suited her up and sent her out. Plot twist, she did very well, like crazy good. The Battle of Orleans proving her grit. The English were so confused and disgruntled by a young peasant girl defeating their armies, they thought it was only proof of one thing, that she wasn't a sign of God, but rather a sign of the devil. How dare a woman beat us in that's man stuff. You can't do that.
At number 5, gong farmer. Now, even though there were simple jobs like being a scribe and carrying water to people, there were also some messy and not so glamorous jobs as well. This next one I'm about to tell you about was definitely one of the worst jobs that you could have. See, there was a time before modern sewers and plumbing were a thing. This was a pretty icky time because rather than waste being disposed of in sewers, they were deposited into a privy or cesspit. Now these things had to be cleaned out periodically, and guess what? There were people who were hired to do just that. The gong farmer was someone who was hired to maintain the cesspits, and so they would be given a large ladle and they would scoop out the waste and transport it away. Now I can only imagine how horrible that job would have been and how horrendous the smell would have been too. It sounds like an absolute nightmare, so I'm glad it's not a thing anymore. At number 4, galley rower. Now, as bad as it might have been to be a gong farmer in the Middle Ages, there was apparently a job that was much worse that people would do anything to get out of, and that was the galley rower. This was considered to be one of the most grueling jobs from the Middle Ages, and I can see why. These people would be tasked with working on a galley and rowing a ship along with a team of up to 1,000 other people. Apparently, people hated this job so much that they would try and avoid being picked to be a galley rower at all costs. Many people would join the priesthood in order to become exempt from becoming a galley rower. Usually this job would go to the poorest peasants and even slaves, as it became more and more difficult to find people for the job. That was one occupation that everyone agreed was the worst. At number 3, cupbearer. Now this is a job that I wish was still around. Not because it's a great job or anything, but I feel like it could have been cool to have my own personal cupbearer so I could feel like a queen, you know? The job of the cupbearer was pretty self-explanatory. Their whole occupation was to serve the monarch their drinks. Now I know I said I would have wanted a cupbearer so I could feel like a bougie queen, but the cupbearer's job was a little more important than just serving drinks. See, there was always the fear that the reigning monarch could get poisoned because it was a very common act of treason back in the Middle Ages. The cupbearer was the only person tasked with serving drinks to the king or queen because they had to make sure that it wasn't poisoned, even if it meant tasting the drink themselves before serving it, just to make sure that all was well in the cup. A lot of trust had to be put into this cupbearer so they could be quite influential in the courts if all went well. They were risking their lives and safety doing a pretty basic task, but it was for the good of the realm. At number 2, alewife. Speaking of drinks though, let's talk about how the drinks got into the cups and who made them. In medieval England, women were mostly tasked with the practice of brewing ale, and they were aptly named alewives as a result. Alewives were very important not only for business, but also for the good of their families. Brewing was a quote, small scale, low investment, low profit, low skilled industry, but it brought success to a lot of married women as well as a substantial amount of independence, since this would have essentially been their business and their own source of income. These women would always be hard at work brewing because they sold their ale quite quickly. Ale didn't have a very long shelf life, and so they would make and sell their beverages quickly to keep up with demand and to compete effectively with others in the trade. Eventually though, the alewife was extinguished by the 15th century as brewing became more commercialized and people sought to take the independence of women away. And finally, at number 1, alchemist. As you can probably imagine, science wasn't all that advanced back in the Middle Ages. There wasn't really much understanding of how the world worked. Back in these days, there were people who tried to practice science in a way that they knew how before many advancements in the field came out, and these people were called alchemists. These alchemists believed that it was possible to change metals and chemicals. They tried to purify metals to change them into other things, and one of the most common experiments was trying to convert tin into gold or silver. For other alchemists though, their mission was to come up with new medicines to heal people and cure them of their ailments. Alchemists were quite popular until the 17th century as the ideas behind alchemy were replaced by the science of chemistry. I guess you could say that alchemy walked so that chemistry could run.
Number 10, the leech collector. I'll start you guys with an easy one today, because trust me, this list, well, it gets very gross very quick. Leeches were used in medieval medicine to help stop bleeding or to purify you of one of the 4 humors, you know, bile, black bile, all that business. Now usually I wouldn't be agreeing with medieval doctors because, well, it's not a good idea, but there is some merit to the leeches cleaning up blood. It's still done today, mind you, in a much more controlled situation with antibiotics on standby, etc. In ye olde times, someone had to go get them though. Someone had to roll up their sleeves or, well, actually keep them rolled down and walk into the swamp or whatever murky water there was and pick up the slimy bloodsuckers. It can be worse, as I'll prove in this list, but it's still not a great, it's not fun. I wouldn't want to do that. Picking up leeches and then like you go home and like, gee, I feel really tired today. And you look at your leg and you're covered in leeches, it wouldn't be good. It wouldn't be great. Number 9, groom of the stool. We've talked about this job before on Bumblebee, but Taylor and I think it's very funny because, well, yeah, it is. It's pretty funny. Basically, it's like having a bathroom attendant. Sometimes if I eat too many Slim Jims, candy, beer, and Taco Bell, I get an upset tummy, which means I'll be on the toilet hunched over, wishing to God I didn't have extra hot sauce on my tacos. Well, imagine if there was someone there to help you, someone to just talk you through it along the way, perhaps offer a conversation, a breath mint, and more importantly, aid you in cleansing the royal bottom. Ooh, yes. That's right, back in ye olde England, there was someone who aided the king in his bathroom duties. Funny enough, it was actually a well-respected position. Just, you know, keep some hand sanitizer nearby so you can just clean up after. I wouldn't want to do that. Number 8, the vomit collector. Here we go, folks. Romans, opulent partiers and conquerors of the ancient world. Can you just imagine what one of those parties was like? Oh, I'd love to go. If someone has a time machine, let me know. Call me. Well, supposedly, as the legend goes, the Romans were so opulent, so greedy, that they would vomit to make room for more food and treats at the most greedy of feasts. Well, this wasn't exactly a modern age, so the vomit wasn't going into a toilet or a modern plumbing system. Sometimes just on the floor. So someone had to come over and clean up all that refuse. Yes, that's right, the vomit collectors. Their job was to clean up after all the wealthy people emptying their stomach contents just so they could fill it back up a little more. Or a lot more, because it's a buffet and a feast. Gross. Number 7. Fuller. Fuller? How could this be bad, I thought to myself. What's a fuller? Well folks, in a nutshell, it's someone who treats sheepskins, animal hides, tanning. It was very important in the past. We used animals for a lot of products back then. It's just kind of how we lived. With that being said, the process of which is not very desirable. Sheepskin is actually quite difficult to process without the use of chemicals. Well, and the only readily available chemicals at the time were urine. Oh boy, I want to puke thinking about it. The skins were soaked in urine and then processed. The urine was often collected from multiple people, and oftentimes the fuller would go door to door saying, "Right then, have you got any weed for me?" That's wrong.
Yeah, I'll be right back. I got a pot full. Give me a second. Are you having a good porter? Are you having a good day today?
Right, it's a good day, man. See you later. Thanks for the weed.
That's just so, gross. Number 6. Match girls. Women in the workforce. Tough, dedicated, and in the numbers. Truth be told, I don't know where we'd be if it wasn't for the Rivet Rosie generation, especially during the World War era. I really don't know where we'd be. Couldn't do it without you. Well, let's take the match girls for instance, who work day and night to make the very new and effective phosphorus match. Ooh, one strike all baby, love it. Their job was to take little itty bitty pieces of wood and dip them into a phosphorus solution. Bada bing, bada boom, you got yourself a match. That's how it goes. What's gross is that after years of working there and inhaling the vapors from the chemical soup they were working on, well, it had some pretty nasty side effects. It would cause cheeks to have a strange glow about them, and most commonly gums to bleed and have an awful smell pouring out of your mouth. That's not good. The only cure was to have an infected jawbone removed. Oh, that does not sound good. I don't like that. That's not good.
Number 5 are the wet nurses. Wet nurses are found in all statuses and were for all statuses. One common denominator though is that the career kind of really sucked. Pun intended. So, first their social status was always determined by the status of who they were breastfeeding. Royal family? Congrats on your special privileges, statues, private quarters, and your own tomb in the family pyramid. Also, her family would receive special perks as an extension of her. Now, royal families only wanted high status wet nurses, and while it's not clear how they were chosen, evidence suggests some kind of blood tie or faint familiar relation. Most wet nurses were from marginalized families in lower socioeconomic statuses and worked under conditions and pre-definitive wages. Wet nurse requirements for any status were intense. She'd have to have given birth at least twice, have a large but healthy body due to the belief that large bodies were more nourishing. Despite that, her breasts should be medium. Too small, not enough food. Too big, the baby's spoiled. In addition to all of these prerequisites, the wet nurse should be sweet-tempered, affectionate, and responsive to her charge. She should also abstain from intercourse because it could reduce her affection towards a child, and they also said no alcohol. A good call, knowing what we know now. Wet nurses were women exploited for the products of their bodies. As slaves, they were coerced for their milk. As lower social status women, they were employed for their bodies to enhance their inadequate domestic status. Even her own household suffered physically and monetarily if a wet nurse defaulted or failed a contract. On the same page, surrogates are number 4. This is a widespread practice in Egypt. The first story of surrogacy found in Genesis 16 of the Bible was the story of infertile Sarah having Egyptian Hagar carry her child for her and her husband Abraham. Even Egyptian pharaohs had used concubines to produce heirs. They often married their sisters or aunts, and children born of these marriages were most of the time not in great or functional health and wouldn't survive. Any child born of a concubine for a pharaoh was accepted as his lawful offspring. Now, they were quite limited in their rights, and they could only inherit the throne in case of the absence of another more entitled heir. Surrogates experienced similar contracts and status leveling as wet nurses. They were desired to be mothers already, have a bigger, healthier body, and naturally beauty was a desired element as well. Women of low status who made a career of surrogacy often died in childbirth or from hemorrhages due to the repetitive birthing process, but for some, it was the only career they could have. Priestess is number 3, and so while it was a male-dominated field, many women were employed as a priestess or a high priestess at the temples around Egypt. Mostly from upper status, many were married to the priests, which they owed their position in society. Despite this, they played roles in the temple rituals, such as servicing goddesses Hathor, Neith, and Pakhet, or working as dancers, musicians, singers, and acrobats in the temple. The most important priestess was known as the god's wife Amun. This woman was usually the daughter of the pharaoh or sometimes his
wife. She usually held a very high position in court and performed important rituals to honor the god Amun. The priestess was in charge of managing the gods' affairs, attending to ritual dances and performances, shaking their rattles and rattling their necklaces, which were long and heavily beaded objects. By the beginning of the New Kingdom in 1550, the title Chantress of Amun was used, and it was usually the wives of the priests who gained these elevated positions as well. The concept of a woman as a priest was unheard of in many kingdoms. A high priestess and the reverence and traditions of female gods being led by women were unusual to outsiders of Egypt, who oftentimes restricted most priestly activities to just men. Number 2 is professional mourners. Okay, so here's a weird one. Professional or paid mourning is an occupation not only found in Egypt, but in China, the Mediterranean, and Eastern Europe. This practice is literally paying a stranger to attend a funeral to lament, deliver a eulogy, help comfort the family, entertain, or lay on the ground wailing. There's some range here, depends on what kind of funeral you want to have. These paid mourners made ostentatious displays, messy hair and smudged makeup, wailing, pounding on the ground or their chests, throwing themselves about as they smeared dirt and sand all over their body while they screamed. It's a full spectacle. Now, another depiction of the paid mourners in Egypt is a little more chill. 2 women impersonating the goddesses Isis and Nephthys. They were believed to play a special role in someone's death. Most inscriptions of a funeral where they are present as paid mourners, they are on each side of the corpse and their bodies are fully shaved. These women also had to be childless and have a tattoo of either Isis or Nephthys' name on their shoulder. Most evidence of professional mourning is seen in pyramids and tomb inscriptions, such as women holding their bodies dramatically in sorrow, braced over a casket with tears flowing. If you were a theater kid, this was definitely the type of job for you. And number 1, it's the female physician. Egypt is a difficult one with historians. There's been a lot of largely ignored discoveries due to the opinions of those who found them. The evidence of women in ancient Egyptian medical fields is part of that because, as it turns out, their physicians were actually primarily women. Evidence shows women in the medical profession going back into early dynastic period Egypt, when Merit Ptah was the royal court's chief physician in 2700 BCE. She was the first female doctor known in world history, but there is another unnamed female physician who is listed to be the head of the Temple Neith Medical School in 3000 BCE, so maybe not. But either way, the first female doctor was in ancient Egypt. Women were highly respected throughout Egypt's history, and many of their goddesses represented facets of health. Neith has been associated with the invention of birth, and Hathor represents fertility. 4 deities associated with healing are Heka, Sekhmet, Serket, and Nefertum, which are all female. So, bizarre claims you may have heard that no women are involved in Egyptian medicine don't accord with the values of their civilization, which were incredibly equitable. By this reasoning, there were no women involved in anything of note anywhere in the world until the modern era, because history books make no mention of their contributions. But it's all up to say.
Kicking off our list at number 10, ancient Roman winemaking. Good about 4 years. Almost ready. Ah yes, the Roman days, where we all wear togas and drink delicious wine and, you know, get close with each other for days on end. Well, I hate to break it to you, but this wine sucked. It was dangerous to consume. Being a winemaker, this ancient sommelier, you would consume about 12 grams of lead per day, just tasting your creation, right? It's horrible. Winemakers would harvest the grapes, they would press the fat with their feet, the best part, right? It's what we all want to do. And then in order to wash out that size 14 Roman foot taste, makers would lace the wine with lead to, you know, sweeten it up. Remember what we did to Coca-Cola back in the day? That wasn't nearly as bad as a bottle of red lead redemption back in the ancient Roman times. Yeah, I'm gonna never complain about table wine at a wedding ever again. Red or white, I'm like, thank you. I don't care if it's really warm. Thank you.
Number 9. Leech collectors. Dude, if you didn't grow up fishing, this next one's gonna make your skin crawl. Leeches. Just watch Stand By Me, you'll get it. These bloodsuckers have been collected for years, like centuries years, and still used to this day. Used as an ancient medicinal aid, leeches would let your bloodletting. Basically just suck out all the infection, disease, germ, nastiness right out of you and all out of that wound. They basically eat the infection and speed up the process. A leech collector did exactly that. They jumped into bogs and marshes and just kinda let them attach themselves to, well, themselves. Then bottle them up and sell them. Tons of health benefits too. Some negatives, of course. First off, the leech collectors could bleed a lot. Obviously, right? Back and forth, in and out of the river for hours. Sometimes these guys would even pass out or die. No band-aids, unfortunately. No added danger pay too. I didn't expect that one.
Number 8, armpit plucker. My unibrow, this right here, This is a new hobby of mine. I'm plucking this bad boy every other day and I'm thrilled about it. Armpit hair, on the other hand, I would shriek, okay? I only have like 7 armpit hairs, so I gotta preserve them, right? But in ancient times, they gots to go. Working out was often done naked, right? Ancient Greek naked exercise in the scorching sun, nothing better. So naturally an armpit or two is gonna stink. So the solution here to stay, sane while you're training was for everybody to just pluck their armpit hairs out, okay? No more unpleasant odors, that's it. But the point here, imagine doing that job. Somebody had to do, doink. Someone had to do all of them. I mean, plucking hairs now, that's satisfying at least and a little bit, easier. You could laser half your But a warrior's armpit? No thank you. The Old Spice guy would have quit his job.
Number 7, barber surgeons. If you like candy like me, you've made a regular visit to the dentist. Little numbing here, a little numbing there, little flavored mold and floss. Yeah, not always as comfortable. Actually, a trip to the dentist chair was extremely scary and dangerous. Good news is they also cut your hair. A barber surgeon was a very popular and respected job throughout the Roman times all the way to about the 18th century. These people were skilled at anything surgical. Remove a tooth, get all the bugs and lice out of your hair, I'll do it in one sitting. Not the cleanest job though. Lice, blood, infected teeth just hanging around all day, the smell alone, ugh. You know everyone had tonsil stones back then too. Worms living in their teeth. They had an extensive understanding of the human body. Well, as best they could. These people were also in charge of dyeing hair as well. Pigeon poop, urine, dung. These people tried it all for that Farrah Fawcett blonde blowout. Okay, so a little 1 on the sides, 2 on top, and then we're just gonna yank those teeth right out of you. Alright, should be about 15 minutes.
Number 6, toad doctor. If you don't want to go through the lengths of becoming a medical doctor or doing anything, just go the toad route. It's a little bit easier. Be very specific about where you're doing your activities. There you go. That way your competition is next to none, right? There you go. Back in the day, it was the 1600s, mind you, but medical researchers believed that toads had inside of them healing properties. That's me spreading out of a toad, so you can see that. So they were often dried up and powdered and then applied directly to your skin to soothe inflammation. Awesome. I don't know what's worse in this situation, the guy getting the toad's guts rubbed on his orbital, or the doctor who has to dry up said toad. Both are pretty bad. Number 5, ewerer. Ah yes, the ewerer. That's an easy word to say right there. Ewerer. Ewerer. While water carriers were responsible for carrying fresh water supplies throughout town, the ewerer was responsible for nobles and their water supply. Yeah, see, these lucky lads had the misfortune of transporting boiling hot water. For tea, hand washing, a hot bath, you name it, all that nice stuff. Anything you desire that requires boiling hot water from all the way across town, well, the calm ewerer has your back. What a stressful job. Uneven stone roads, good luck not spilling all over yourself. Number 4, a scribe. Scribes would copy text, something that would take months, right? It would be a horrible job. My wrist hurts sometimes filling out my name. I'm like, oh, I haven't done this in years. You ever read the terms and conditions to an iPhone? Imagine life before copy and paste. You had to write that out. It was a process. I mean, first you had to convince somebody to let you, borrow their codex. Yeah, people don't trust me with their phone chargers, let alone their codex. Okay, you take that for months at a time, of course at a high cost, a lot of trust there, because many didn't know how to write. And to be fair, if I magically got transported back to the Middle Ages, they wouldn't be able to read my chicken scratch at all. Also ink? Good luck, no way. I cannot do it. I'm barely figuring out pens today. If you dabbled in calligraphy, this was the job for you. But again, it wasn't an easy job. Imagine trying to write out the speech of a drunken king. You're like, did he say wither or thither? This guy's asleep. Number 3, lector. Long before Spotify or even before the miracle worker herself, that is LimeWire. May she rest in peace. Couldn't have grown up without her. Factory workers needed entertainment to distract themselves from the repetitive, horrible tasks all day long. I mean, we're talking about a time where women were making arsenic dresses for a living. This was long before the labor board ever existed, right? It was all bad. It's 1929, workers are treated like complete trash, so they decide to liven up the workday by bringing in a lector. A lector would read the news or literature out loud to workers all day long, every single day. Out loud. with bad breath. It sounds like a nice gesture on paper, but in reality, factory workers were then forced to pitch in portions of their own pay in order to fund these guys. Yeah, they would have to make less money to hear Schmo Rogan talk about politics all day. That's horrible. Not everybody was on board here, so naturally thousands of workers ended up going on strike because, you know, this guy wouldn't shut up. I mean, some cases, sure, entertain away, but if you need to focus all day long, maybe you're using small parts, maybe you're repairing a watch or two, it's kind of hard to get your job done when dude's in the corner trying to figure out commas, you know what I mean? He's like, and I'll huff, and I'll puff, and what's this word? You're like, guy, I'm trying to make an arsenic watch. Please shut up. Number 2, watching paint dry. Before we get to our big bad number 1, I have to include this modern curveball. I can't believe this is a real job. This is hilarious. There's a man in his late 30s right now named Dr. Thomas Kerwin. Sorry, he's not a man. He's a doctor. A doctor who makes a living by watching paint dry. Yes, this man currently works for Dulux Paint, and he studies paint under a microscope and also as it paints on a wall. He has to time it. This makes sense. When fast drying paint is a main selling point, somebody, again, needs to do this job. Somebody's got to figure that out, right? And that somebody here is Dr. Thomas Kerwin. What a champ, that's amazing. When asked about his profession on catersnews.com, Dr. Thomas replied, "People think I stare at walls, constantly checking my watch, i.e. me, to time how long it takes. If that was the case, I would be bored out of my mind. Fortunately, when you look under a microscope, it brings everything to life. A liter of paint consists of 1,000,000 billion particles. So there's plenty to see before the paint even hits the wall." 1,000,000 billion, that's something that's made up. Yeah, there's 1,000,000 billion particles in this paint. $26.99 a can. Here you go. Look at this green. We actually painted this. Dulux green. It was great. You wouldn't even guess. Number 1, groom of the stool. Nowadays, higher ups in the office, they have assistants grab your coffee for you. Maybe they answer some phone calls, keep the business running while you're off golfing, you know, doing stuff that matters. Assistants are vital. The groom of the stool though, that's a bit much. That was a bit too close for me, I think. We have some labor laws put in place now. I don't think we're gonna see an online job opening for a groom of the stool, but you never know. I will definitely apply, let's do it. Back in the Dark Ages, this role again was vital and respected. It was created by King Henry VIII, and this role was to assist the king, specifically assist his bowel movements. Grooms of the stool had a box that they carried with them at all times, and that's where the magic happened. The dark magic, that is. And you would literally follow the king until he needed you. Porta potties weren't a thing at this time, and there's no way you're gonna catch a king squatting in the woods behind a bush. You're not gonna catch King Henry VIII like, "Hey, don't look. Do you have any leaves?" No, not at all. In fact, you wouldn't even catch a king wiping his own behind. That chore was also reserved for said groom of the stool. Yeah, lucky you, right? Yuck. In this stool, you would have water, hopefully, towels, a wash bowl, the whole setup. You're probably thinking, Taylor, which poor soul had to be stuck with this role? A prisoner? Somebody who lost their sense of smell? Sight, hopefully, everything? Nope. Only sons of noblemen could take on this role, and in doing so they also gain access to every single room in the castle, and tons of clothes, and any bedchamber, furnishings, anything they want, and of course a higher pay. Moving off the list at number 10, Plague Body Collector. Immediately into the dark and dirty. Here we go, we're not wasting any time today. Plague body collectors were vital back in the 14th century when bodies were quite literally starting to pile up. Somebody had to go in and somebody had to move them. That's pretty much this entire list. Somebody had to do it. So using an old cart and a dirty rag only, they would have to carry plague-ridden corpses 28 city blocks away. Great job, we love it. They would also cover the bodies in flowers to prevent disease, or so they thought. Yes, this tulip ought to prevent the plague. Number 9, galley rower. My arms are tired just thinking about this job. Here we go, I gotta warm up. Back in the Middle Ages, if you were assigned to work on a galley, well, you better hope you were below deck scrubbing something with someone. Some sort of swashbuckler, something, I don't know, I've seen Pirates of the Caribbean once. If you were a galley rower, you would be tired all day long. Some large vessels had around 1,000 crewmen. This was now a faster and more fierce way than any sail, but you needed a bicep or two, right? Benjamin Arbel, author of A Companion to Venetian History, states that back in the 1400s, a galley rower was one of the most detested obligations among Venice's colonial subjects. Yeah, obviously, they would do anything they could to avoid this position, which would sometimes include becoming a priest. Yeah, rowing a boat or Jesus, what's easier? They're like, Jesus, definitely Jesus. I don't blame them, I would hate that job as well. These noodles right here, this wouldn't do any good for any army. I'll complain about my arms being tired while in a paddle boat. You know what I mean? Think about that one. Number 8, cup bearer. One of the most important roles in the castle, of course, belongs to the cupbearer. I have a Yeti, also quite important. Yeah, these guys don't just sit in the corner and play the cup song on repeat, although that would be amazing. We're like, yes, more of that. This is the first piece of music we've ever had. No, they would serve royalty their drinks. They were responsible for making sure nobody has tampered with any cup. This was a noble spot to have. The king really needs to trust their cupbearer, obviously. The best part of this position was also the most dangerous. See, cupbearers were responsible for tasting the king's beverage each and every time. You know, to make sure there wasn't any poison. That's horrible. It's kind of good though, I don't know. By the time dinner was over, Buddy probably had no idea which way was up. He's like, here you go, it's safe, and then immediately faints. Number 7, resurrectionalist. Yeah, you don't see a lot of these guys around anymore, eh? Wonder why, that's odd. A resurrectionalist is exactly what it sounds like. It's absolutely disgusting, and dare I say a bit of hogwash. These guys were responsible for digging up dead bodies, and then they would sell them to medical schools. All in the name of science. Gross, disgusting science. This was in the late 1820s, and at this time in Edinburgh, Scotland, the medical science community was on the up and up because of these guys. But in order to study new medicines to, you know, avoid the next plague, they needed to get dirty. I'll tell you what they didn't need though. They didn't need William Burke and William Hare. See, these two Irish brothers, they were both resurrectionalists who were running out of patience and money. So they themselves would end up taking people out and then proceed to sell their corpses right after. They did this 17 times. They killed 17 people all in the course of 2 years. Then they sold their corpses to one Dr. Robert Knox. Yeah, it took 17 killings before somebody caught on to the system of theirs. Hare testified against Burke, so Burke got the old gallows treatment and was publicly dissected. His skeleton is actually, hilariously enough, still on display at the Edinburgh Medical College Museum to this day. So if you want to go flip off a skeleton, there you go. Number 6, fullers. Ancient Romans were pretty creative, dare I say. That's what we'll say about that. Recently we did a list on dark medical practices used in history, and in that list we talked briefly about how urine was used by ancient Romans to, you know, whiten their smile. We love that. Fresh breath guaranteed. They also used urine to wash their clothes. They didn't use soap because the amount of ammonia in your pee often did the trick. Again, creative. Lye was also used to clean clothes at this time, but it was pricey, so plan B was to head down to the old laundromat and then hand your dirties over to a fuller. Yeah, these lucky lads would have to stand in a tub filled with chemicals, water, and, well, yes, lots of urine, and then just stomp. Just stomp and scrub for hours. Urine collected from all over town. How lucky is that guy? And of course, most of the time, they would get extremely ill. Obviously, just breathing that in. From one of the many poisons that they're splashing around in, that'd be the worst job. Ugh, this should have been number 1. But it's not, trust me, it's not.
Number 5, an animal inseminator.
We basically collect the semen off them, we freeze it, we chill it, and we send that semen globally. Rather than having to take the stallion to the mare, you can ship it around anywhere.
Okay, so this exists. Though this guy seems to be absolutely like loving his job, which is great. People who do this for a living are essential for breeding purposes, though it is definitely not for everybody. Without going into too much detail, I'm going to try to describe this job as creatively as possible. In many ways, this job requires the employee to act as both lover and stork for certain animals such as cows and horses. The reason it exists is for the convenience of better breeding because they don't have to travel a breed or wait for them to mate. So instead, they position themselves to catch their mini selves and then they manually inject them into mares, like cows for example, and horses. So not a very romantic process, but then again, whatever gets the job done, I suppose. But the grossest part, even if you can't get your head around the other bit, oftentimes the animal reacts to the injection of the baby juice by pooping really close to the inseminator's face. So like, definitely not for the faint of heart. Number 4, shark suit tester. This list is basically partially in honor of every dirty job Micro has ever done. So he's gonna be featured again. Why putting a synthetic body within a chainmail suit wouldn't be a viable option for testing this? Apparently it isn't. There are not many jobs Mike Rowe found difficult to muster courage for, but this job remains in his top 5 jobs he wouldn't do again. According to Rowe, quote, "The only way to see if a stainless steel shark suit works is to put one on and jump feet first into a full-on feeding frenzy, to be bitten by a variety of hungry sharks and shook like a tug toy for 60 feet below the surface. I did this job for Shark Week against my better judgment, but lived to tell the tale. Not dirty, but straight up terrifying. I won't be doing it again. Ever." Unquote. Like, Mike Rowe, if you ever watch the show Dirty Jobs, Mike Rowe has gone through a lot. Like, he went and checked out a bunch of different jobs, and he doesn't even have to do each one for the rest of his life. He just tried a bunch of different ones. Great show, but if like that scared him, it sounds terrifying. That's not a job I would like to do. Number 3, pet food taster. Ice cream taster, amazing. Chip flavor taster, yes please. Sommelier, sign me up. But did you know there was such a thing as a pet food taster? Good to know that at least the flavor profile is human approved for your pupper, but imagine tasting that for a living. Also, it is pet food, so it could be dog food, but it could also be like bird seed or bunny pellets. However, it does take a very highly skilled person to do it, as it's a combination of research and taste. They have the job of evaluating a pet's nutritional value in their food and are tasked with finding ways they can improve that. But eventually, they do have to sample it, put it on a little bib. Yum. They evaluate the scent, as it has to do with both human senses. After all, you don't want the house stinking like fish or dog food. And as well, and most importantly, for the pet. Thankfully, they do spit it out after reviewing the flavor, texture, and consistency. Unless it's really good, they probably just make that their lunchtime. Number 2, a chicken sexer. What a title, you know? What do you do for a living? I'm a chicken sexer. How do you bring that up to your in-laws? I'm not sure if my life is better knowing that the job of a chicken sexer actually exists, but for all the chicken that is consumed every day, it is really important. A chicken sexer's job is to distinguish the sex of a hatchling. Sounds okay so far, but it's how they do it that often gets really messy. The first version of this technique isn't so bad. Feather sexing is only done on broiler chickens that have a genetic mutation where female feathers grow faster, therefore they can kind of tell, but vent sexing is a little, you know, interesting. They have to hold a chicken a certain way and very gently squeeze the poop out so they can see the intestines. Then they can see the reproductive organs, which therefore determines the sex. This method was invented in the 1930s in Japan, and though effective, not the prettiest job. But hey, $60K a year, not bad. Number 1, last but not least, a sewer inspector. Number 1, here we go. I think this is pretty self-explanatory, so if you want to skip ahead to liking and commenting portion of this video, then I won't blame you. But in the words of yet again, the one, the only, Mike Rowe, aside from sloshing through a relentless chocolate tide, inspectors encounter a myriad of man-made products that shouldn't be flushed down the toilets, along with roaches the size of thumbs and rats the size of bread loaves. It's hot, dirty, and too smelly to describe. Unquote. God! No thank you, never gonna do that. I don't know if you could pay me enough, if I'm being honest. But you can make anywhere from 52 to 72 grand a year for this dirty job, and as you can probably guess, it is essential. It is a privilege to be able to flush away our problems. So to all those watching who may work as sewer inspectors or in the sewer industry, we salute you. Number 10, watching paint dry. Do you remember that thing that camp counselors used to do in the whole camp? If they were like acting crazy, they'd get you to sit down all together and like watch the paint dry, and if somebody like little Timmy spoke out, then you'd have to restart. Anybody else do that? Just me? Okay. Fun. Anyways, so imagine my surprise to learn that something that was used as a mild punishment is the actual job of a man named Keith Jackson. Jackson lived in the UK, and his job was literally to watch paint dry. He worked for a paint manufacturer and had to determine how well the paint was drying. So according to Jackson, it actually had some pretty high stakes, and I quote, "Watching paint dry sounds quite easy, but it can be stressful at times." Unquote. The more you know. Number 9, a crime scene cleaner. Of course someone has to do this. It is definitely a job I believe exists. Though I never really thought of it existing, I just thought they would just clean it up. But anyways, it definitely exists because we would know if someone had died in the house we were about to buy because it would still be a mess. But imagine the things you would see and how awful that would be. How do you even get a job like that? I do know that there are a lot of crime enthusiasts on this site, so I googled it. Turns out there is a job application, so you can just apply. It is for a company called Aftermath Services in Vancouver, and it's a $500 sign-on bonus. Guess they're really looking for workers. Whatever brave souls are out there, we thank you for your service. Also, here's a perk. Considering the nature of this work, it definitely sounds like it's recession-proof. Number 8. Roadkill collector. Speaking of a crime scene cleaner, next up we have a roadkill collector. Yeah, this might be news for some of you who thought the squirrel you hit just like melted into the pavement after a few days of cars going over it. But no, this job actually exists and it's not ideal. The task is sometimes grueling because often the poor little babies are, well, in the middle of the road. So they have to run out and scrape and scoop the critter out of there, all while like avoiding all the cars coming at them, otherwise trying to make them roadkill as well. On top of that, considering the conditions in which they perished, the stench and scenery is enough to churn even a sewer rat's stomach, so. Number 7, a telemarketer. I know, we all know these exist, but like, I actually don't think anybody actually thinks about a telemarketer as an actual job. They're always the people that call you right as you're about to sit down for dinner being like, do you want to buy this toy spork? And you're like, no, I don't want to do that. I've seen people toy with them, I've seen people hang up the phone right away, like if you pick up the phone and no one is there right away, like hang up. If someone says, hi, I'm calling on that, like you just hang up. They get told no in so many creative ways. It's almost like a special skill to be able to receive that much rejection consecutively. Wow, it's like being an actor. But many people depend on this job as their living and experience verbal abuse from many customers. Having to endure that kind of negativity all day, every day would be pretty hard to handle. So maybe we can be a little kinder. On top of that, they get paid most of the time on score-based systems, so they can't really take no for an answer until they've given it their best shot. So like, just be as polite as possible, but I get it, it's super annoying. Number 6, snake researcher. It shouldn't be a surprise to you that of course we are going to bring up Mike Rowe, the dirty job man of the hour. I like snakes. I feel like there are two kinds of people. The people who are like afraid of snakes but not spiders, and the people who are afraid of spiders but not snakes, you know what I mean? I'm the latter. So when I saw this job I didn't think it would be awful at all, but it's nowhere near what you think. Mike Rowe says this is one of the grossest jobs he's ever done because, and I quote, to properly study the feeding habits of water snakes in Michigan, snake researchers pull large snakes from Lake Erie, squeeze them until they puke, then analyze their vomit to see what they've been eating. It's as disgusting as it sounds, but on the day in question, to add to the excitement, I was bitten no less than 36 times. Annoying, bloody, and very dirty. Unquote. Mike Rowe. Oh, we salute you.
Number 5. Queen. It is unusual. Most people didn't get to be royal. I mean, think about it, seriously. Although I'd certainly like to be, I can't just imagine it. King of the internet. King of the black hoodie, nice, or king of the Chinese buffet. My point is that while women in medieval times didn't get the respect that they deserve, and every girl does, queens just had it better, and that's unusual. The queen might not have been as well respected as the king, but compared to the peasantry, she was fed, had 4 walls around her that didn't leak or wind would, seep through or blow down, and wasn't working herself to the grave every day to provide for a king and queen that didn't think very much about them. That's a really hard life to live. Number 4, cooking. Chief, somebody had to do it. Although, there's something that tells me the food wasn't that good. This isn't exactly Gordon Ramsay's 5-star cuisine. Beans, cabbage, eggs, onions, bread, and of course beer or ale to wash it down. The peasantry just didn't have the same access to food like royalty did. Although with a list like that, it sounds like it's a fast-tracked way to an upset stomach or some really grody gas, dude. It was women who would often be preparing those delicious dishes. Besides the hours I would spend on the commode after visiting a commoner's house from eating that, the taste is something worth talking about, I think. When you guys are cooking chicken, for example, what are your favorite recipes, spices, flavors? Let us know in the comments, I'm curious. My favorite chicken is barbecue chicken. Brush a little Diana sauce. Medieval folks just didn't have that. More upsetting than that is the lack of spices in general. While there were some, anything not local would have been crazy expensive and not available to common folks. Medieval women did the best with what they could when they had it. That's just how it goes, Chief. I talked to him, he's a chef, he said it's alright. Number 3, nuns. It makes sense, honestly. Becoming a woman of God was honestly a good career choice for a woman. For starters, you become a woman of God, and that means you're protected under his vision. Thank you, Jeebus. And people need that back then, seriously. Secondly, it would also give you a place to live. Some nuns stayed in one town and others traveled where needed, staying in monasteries and convents where it was possible, and probably more comfortable than living in the mud and stone huts that the serf women were living in. And lastly, they got rulers and sticks, and if someone was bad, they would punish them when they misbehave. Oh, sorry sister, I didn't mean to say naughty words in the classroom. I guess you'll have to spank Chetty now, ooh. All jokes aside, this might have been one of the best things for a woman to be, besides royalty or marrying rich. It's just how the times went. Number 2, landowner. I was shocked by this one too, honestly, but yes, women could own land. Sort of. It wasn't a blanket green light, it's a bit more confusing than that. Some could, some couldn't. There was a few rules here and there. They were stupid man patriarch poo-poo rules, but rules nonetheless. In Normandy, for example, only men and their sons could possess land ownership. In the Basque region, both sons and daughters could inherit land. In England, both could, but if there were any surviving men or brothers, then they would be considered first, and not women at all sometimes. So no, it's not as open as today, and you probably would catch some strange looks as a woman rolling up to an empty lot and staking your shovel in the ground. It makes life a lot easier if there aren't so many rules, and I know you guys agree with me at home. The less red tape, the better, right? And be nice to girls, be nice to women. Number 1, artists. This one hits home. I think Chris can agree with me on this one. A lot of male artists, writers, and poets get remembered from history, but there was a few decent female ones too. We gotta give them some spotlight. It sucks that males get all the spotlight. To me, this makes sense. In my experience, a lot of girls I knew growing up had natural talent for arts. I remember growing up in school and art class was always one of my worst subjects. No, not because I didn't follow directions, but my art never came out the way I wanted it to. I didn't feel the motivation, babe. I couldn't see the motivation. Most of the girls in art class just passed with flying colors. No pun intended. And for writing, well, besides my dyslexia, if you looked at a paper I wrote in the 6th grade versus a girl from my classroom in the 6th grade, what's the difference? Well, you can actually read hers. Mine are terrible. All grade school antics aside, notable artists and writers include Clerica Gouda, that's a cool name, and Hildegard of Bingen. Names you might not know, but for sure are worth a Google search.
Kicking off our list at number 10, ship surgeon. Ah yes, just the place you want to get a root canal. The high seas. During the age of sail, the Royal Navy, of course, needed trained medical officers aboard its warships. People got sick, obviously, they got sick a lot back then, so this is who would have to deal with them. By 1814, the Royal Navy had 850 surgeons with 500 assistants, all caring for 130,000 men on shore and at sea. Yeah, they would make a lot of money, but in turn, it's a disgusting job. The surgeon was responsible for his entire crew. They would have to visit patients at least twice a day and keep accurate records on each of them, again, on a ship. Not a hospital, but on a rocking ship. Surgeons were responsible for regulating sanitary conditions on the ship. Yes, sand would have to be poured down on the bottom of the cabins to avoid the doctors slipping from all the blood on the ground. Yeah, it's that kind of gross, you know what I mean? Number 9. Bad bartenders. When we think of old saloons, we imagine the swinging doors, a few catchphrases here and there, and then of course, whiskey. The bartender pours a drink, the cowboy takes the bottle instead, and then walks away. So illegal. Sir, that is theft. Bring that right back. That's a classic cowboy, right? Back in the Wild Western days, grabbing a drink at the bar sucked. It wasn't great. It was deadly, if anything. Bartenders had no regulations to follow behind that rickety, rotten bar. So not only was it very high proof, but some bevies like tarantula juice Yeah, if its name didn't tip you off, it was literally made from poisonous ingredients, hence tarantula juice. It was made from strychnine, and if you drank it, you felt like there was tarantulas crawling all over your skin. Yeah, which button do I press to not tip the bartender? Thanks so much. Number 8, medieval punishment cleaner. If this isn't your first rodeo here on Bumblebee, you've heard us talk the many horrors of medieval history. A lot of heads coming off around a lot of horrible kings. Many executions were public. The town would come out, watch a hanging or two, and then grab some bread and walk home. This was normal back then. So gross. One of the earliest documented executioners began all the way back in 1202. The OG headsman, Nicholas Johann. Their nickname was the Justice, which, I mean, as far as nicknames go, it's pretty sick. Afterwards, of course, there was inspiration. This position spread through many capitals and large towns of Western Europe, but with them came the execution cleaners. Over his 36 years of ruling, King Henry VIII executed roughly 57,000 people. Yep, hope you like mopping. You'd be doing a lot of that over with King Henry. Number 7, violin string maker. A violin may sound beautiful, but the way those strings would come together, even before the 17th century, not so lovely, not so, it's kind of yuck. In order to make strings thick enough to play these 3-stringed violins, the go-to method back then involved twisting strands of sheep innards together. Yeah, hours would have to be spent just trimming away at fatty tissue or blood vessels, muscle, you name it, things you don't want to see or smell. Yeah, you gotta sift through that for a bit. It did not look like a music shop at that moment, yuck. And then said guts had to be soaked in wood ash to further clean and avoid rotting. Nowadays, it's a little different. Actually, not really, it still sucks for animals, but, you know, less bloody, less dirty, I guess, all around. Number 6, nomenclator. Basically, a campaign volunteer back in the Middle Ages. Only you weren't a volunteer, and the campaign was a miserable fat king. A nomenclator in old European times was responsible for remembering names of people that the king met all night long. You know, how to contact new business partners, which family they're in, which family they're not in, you know, keeping track of all the social politics of being a king. All that responsibility fell on the nomenclator, because the king was too busy getting drunk and partying or cheating or beheading. No way a drunken king is gonna remember all these new faces from all over the land. That's all this poor fella over here. Sorry, was it Arthur or Arnold? Yeah, I can't hear you over all this capital punishment. Thanks, you have to speak up a bit.
Number 5, gardeners. If you've ever done some fun gardening on a nice Sunday afternoon, you'll know that your back hurts, there's bees everywhere, and it's hot under that sun. Gardening is hard work. Imagine being a gardener in Rome or Middle Ages. Like no tools, no water source, no sun safety. And the king's private fruits here and queen's favorite red anthuriums there. Gardens up walls, secret private hidden gardens underground. That's a long day. Also, that's a lot of walking pails of water to these things. Yeah, no hoses. Like to walk to the river and grab a bucket and come back. A lot. These people must have had shoulders and lats like a great white shark, dude. Just squatting double pails for 16 hours a day? You know those people were jacked. Also, they didn't have weed whackers, so when you look at these beautiful painted castles and gardens, just know someone was getting screamed at with a rusty pair of shears. Yeah. Also, no lawnmowers. Like how? The whole field? Okay.
Number 4, arming squire. Being a knight obviously sounds cool. They have the sword, the horse, the flowing hair, the lady, they're saving the, the damsel in the tower with the dragon and the breath. We get it, we've seen Shrek. Sometimes they lose a hand like Jaime Lannister, okay? But that's just what being a knight is, right? It's glorious, right? Well, first of all, this process starts when you're 7 years old. Then you would be given to a noble to learn for 7 more years. Now finally at age 14, you would become a squire. A knight's intern. Yeah, not an ideal job to have when you're young, but a royal job nonetheless. And also you don't have a choice, so have fun. Arming squires, see, these lads had the responsibility of repairing a knight's armor while the knight was still wearing it. Yeah, up close and personal. Yeah, which buckle broke was it? Awesome, awesome. How was the battle? You guys did really well out there. Yeah, repairing chainmail on a grown man's thigh, not ideal. Welcome to the Dark Ages, I guess. After these epic, messy battles, arming squires would have to clean everything off of their armor, inside and out. Yeah, this was long before Dawn soap was a thing, so they had to clean said armor with urine. Yeah, hey, let's wash this piss out with a bucket of piss. That ought to do it.
Number 3, alchemists. Alchemy in history has gone through a couple of transitions. Basically, at first, an alchemist dealt with everything. Literally. From ancient China, India, and Greece, these people mixed what they could find and see. You know what I mean? See what happens if we mix some dirt and some olive oil. You know, write it down. They were scientists. It's the foundation of chemistry alone. They did experiments. heavily spiritual, philosophical, and medicinal. Medieval alchemists produced hydrochloric acid, nitric acid, and sodium carbonate. They were good. One eye of newt here, a little stomach acid here, and whoa, 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 whoa! Also so heavily associated with witchcraft and wizardry over the years. Potions, elixirs, the alchemist's purpose was to advance and help with the quality of life. Lots of explosions though. Yeah, very dangerous. Mercury, carbon monoxide, yeah, dangerous stuff. They were playing around with things that were really bad for us, for the purpose of making us better. Very selfless job, you know?
Number 2, rower. I can't even raise my hand in class longer than 6 minutes. I have to start holding it, then I switch, and then I just bail on the question, and then I live my life not knowing what hydrogen is. Alright? I couldn't imagine being a rower, okay? Heading back to the times of ancient Greece, where wars were fought through naval battle, left-handed, right-handed, guess what? It didn't matter. Your arms were shaking every single day, all day long. When we think of these rowers, this job obviously sucked. It was one of the worst to have, and more often than not, it was sadly slaves who had the misfortune of propelling these warlords into their battle. The payment was also non-existent, really, just a meal for the day, if that. Asking for a break or not keeping up to the rower next to you would ultimately lead to your death.
And the number 1 spot, the gong farmer. The stink of all stinks. These men were employed to go around and basically scoop and clean out bathroom houses. Plumber waste disposal hybrid. You get where I'm going with this. They were the people who dug out and removed human excrement from privies and cesspits. They were the OG waste collectors. But by hand. Yeah. And scoops and buckets and stuff. No gloves, no PPE, just hand loading them into trolleys, buckets sloshing all over the place in the middle of the night. Obviously being disgusting, gong farmers were only allowed to work at night, hence the nightmen. These guys would have to hop down into these pits at night, waist deep, swimming around and just taking turns on who's loading and who's scooping. They were paid well though. Yeah, usually double or triple the regular. Toxic gases, infections, drowning. This job was dangerous. And definitely the grossest. Just sitting on your lunch break, you know what I mean? Ah, ham and cheese, yum.